Thank you for joining us on an audio journey for the next couple hours. In addition to this podcast medium, we also have 3 different blogs available on our website that we invite all listeners to check out. One is the Insight Myanmar blog, which gives behind-the-scenes information on past podcast episodes and sneak previews where we're going. Another is the Burma Dhamma blog, which dates back over a decade now and features all kinds of information about Dhamma practice in Myanmar. The third is the Myanmar Pilgrimage blog, which goes into options for meditators looking to visit the special Dhamma sites in the country. All 3 can be found on our main homepage, insightmyanmar.org. That's Insight Myanmar, one word, INSIGHTMYANMAR. But for now, let's stick with the earbud option and get on to today's show. Okay, so this is a new kind of podcast format that we're trying. We thought about doing a format called Book Review, where we're able to look at some Burma Dhamma books and talk about those books through the prism of our experience as meditators and in the context of practice in Myanmar. And this was kind of on the back burner, not really sure when we were going to do it. And then the idea came up to try it with Carl Stimson. So not only is this a new podcast format for us, it's also a first podcast appearance by Carl, who's an avid podcast listener, but your first time being on the hot seat. So welcome from Japan, and thanks for trying this out.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. So we're going to get into these 3 books you read that are all by meditators and describing meditative experiences, and Myanmar plays a role in all of them somewhat. Before we get into that, I think it's probably good to take a moment to reflect on our relationship and friendship. We're not just 2 guys. We've known each other for more than half our life, went to college together, studied abroad in Europe, ended up going to Japan on a sister city exchange. And I think what's interesting for our listeners especially is that you could say we found Dhamma together. You know, we came from a background of being young kids in college and exploring the town, Tokyo, Roppongi. And then I went to a Vipassana course in the SN Goenka tradition, and it thoroughly changed my life. And a year later, you went through that change. And so I think we've had a really special way of communicating by going through the spiritual experience together from an experience of very much worldly and not spiritual. And often when one person transitions, their community or their friends or their family often is not going through the same thing at the same time with them. So I think it's been interesting for us to have gone through some of those similar experiences at similar times.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it can be very alienating to start a meditation practice or, get into Buddhism. And we'll talk about that with the books that we're going to talk about. And I think it's been great to have a good friend to go through that with. I mean, I think both of us, it's been almost 20 years since those first courses, and we're pretty settled in terms of, our identities as meditators, or at least more settled than we were back in the early 2000s. But there's definitely some difficult transition times. I think, people write these, like the kind of books we're going to talk about are about people's like early experiences with meditation, and those tend to be kind of inspiring stories and maybe kind of adventures, like venturing into a dangerous and difficult land, but at the end they're inspiring, and they're people find a lot of help and a lot of truth from these experiences. But they also entail a major transition in life that sometimes is not easy.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because when you look at making that transition in life, you're often leaving behind the familiar for the unfamiliar and taking a bit of a hero's journey, which always involves some fear and lack of stability and questioning who you are and how you fit in, as we'll get into. And I think that also relates to the journey we've gone to in real time in a similar way, because we've both in similar ways gone from the familiar to the unfamiliar, and yet we are not unfamiliar to each other. And so it's been kind of a sounding board that we've been able to relate as we go through these journeys, even though it's not the exact time, it's something similar. And to go through that with someone that has the background of, going out all night partying or talking about something else entirely, and then being able to transition to this is definitely a kind of a bedrock of familiarity in a practice, which involves something very new and leaving behind, where you come from.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting. We'll talk about this as well, but that experience might be something that happens to fewer and fewer people as meditation and mindfulness becomes more accepted in at least a Western society. Like we'll talk about, two of the authors we'll talk about were hippies, and when they started doing meditation, it was very, very rare for someone in American society to meditate, and that was quite a while ago, 40 years ago or more. And when we started in the early 2000s, it was rare, not as rare, but still pretty rare, and was a big transition. But now, if someone comes up to you and says they've started meditating, it's, a lot of places that's not a really unusual thing. I think, really embracing it and going deep into it is still probably a pretty dramatic, not traumatic, maybe traumatic, depends on the person, but definitely dramatic experience that can be still pretty discombobulating in someone's life. But I think it's becoming easier and easier for people to just, go from not meditating to meditating, and that's great overall. I think it's really like a good sign for society.
Yeah, right. And of course, it also depends on the community that you're in. I remember when I transitioned back to being in the US, and we'll talk about this later as well, but I remember being very kind of out of sorts and then going to Boulder for a weekend, Boulder, Colorado, and being in a grocery line and hearing the cashier and the person in front of me talking about the vibrations that they were both experiencing at that moment. It was like, okay, this is probably a Boulder thing, but this is not a usual experience when you come back from a meditative environment to the US.
Yeah, Boulder's definitely a safe space for those kind of people.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's get into it. But before we get into the actual books, I want to talk a little bit about the process. And so it should be mentioned that what we're talking about is largely based on an essay that you wrote that was published on the blog Inside Myanmar. I was the editor for that piece, so we worked on that for a few weeks to get it to completion. And a lot of our talk is based on that essay, so we definitely encourage people to read that. We'll be posting the link. But I wanted to check in with you and what was that process like in those 3 weeks of bringing the essay from draft to completion form?
Yeah, it was a fascinating process. I read the 3 books in pretty short succession. So, my mind was already kind of attuned to, looking for similarities and different kinds of themes that they all touched on. And, they have some very major similarities that run kind of through them. And I'd also written a couple other kind of book reviews like this for your previous blog. And so I was kind of, in the mode of, well, maybe I'll write another one for these books. And so I had some ideas, but when I got to putting them down, on the Word document, it was a lot more difficult. One thing, it was 3 books at a time, trying to weave that together, and also realizing that there was more to this, just 3 books telling the story. Like there was some really personal thoughts I had for this, and the only really way to convey that was to kind of, tell something about my personal story as well. So that was a really key element in developing the final version of the essay.
Yeah, and actually that was the next thing I wanted to ask, that when I read the first draft, one of the initial pieces of feedback that I had was to make the writing much more personal. I felt that after giving such a deeply personal review of what were basically 3 autobiographical narratives, the reader needed to know who you were in all of this. And I encouraged you, and you did become kind of a 4th character in this saga, where you were able to compare your spiritual journey and the time era in which it took place to theirs and to the time era today. So I'm also wondering what that experience was like for you, deciding to make that shift from just being a book reviewer to really exposing yourself, and if it felt personal or vulnerable, exciting, risky, liberating, fearful, kind of what was coming up as you made the decision to take that step.
Yeah, it was. I had some trepidation for sure. And when people read it, they'll maybe say, "Well, like, geez, this guy doesn't really reveal a whole lot." And I don't have a big like online presence in social media and things like that, so I'm not accustomed to a lot of sharing. So it was kind of a step to do that, and I felt good about it in the end. I think to me it's a fascinating process. What people go through in life when they encounter meditation from a Western standpoint, well, really from any standpoint, but the Western standpoint in particular, because that's what I came through, and how that is playing out over time in two ways, like in time, like throughout a person's life, like in starting off when you first encounter it, and then going through the kind of honeymoon phase, and then what happens afterwards, which is equally interesting but less talked about. And then in time, in terms of years in the age, and all three of these books were basically from the 70s, which is obviously a very different time than right now. And when I was kind of in a young meditator, was in the early 2000s, which was its own different time. And so to kind of think about how all those factors influence a person's experiences is really fascinating. And I hope that me sharing my experiences, which is kind of bridging a gap. I brought in my experience as a kind of older meditator, someone who's been in the game for a longer time than the kind of time frames that these books cover. So that is kind of bridging a gap, and then talking about my experiences in 2000s and 2010s, which is quite different from the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, which are covered by these books.
Yeah, and something I think that's so fascinating about describing that process is that when you're involved in meditation, and especially when you're in intensive meditation, so you're not like living a relaxed life of a monk or nun who has time to develop, and you're learning Vinaya and maybe skills of living in the forest and learning about the local culture that you're in, and you don't really have like an intensive time frame. You can kind of relax into the Dhamma and learn things gradually as they come. But when you're a householder in an intensive meditation retreat, you're feeling yourself as a yogi, and you're also getting the instruction to maximize the best use of your time by just practice, practice, practice. And when you bring that mentality to bear, sometimes you don't have that metacognition of the life cycle or the process or the stages that you go through. And so as you're going through different stages, you're sometimes not having the understanding of the mentality of what this cycle and process is. That is not an unusual cycle for many people from this background that are practicing in this way. And just focusing on that micro vision of the practice and continuing and pushing ahead without the bigger overall context in which it occurs. And so to me, one of the most interesting things about these kind of conversations, and also about not just the books, but the way that you approach these books, is that it's looking in a wider point of view from what is the cycle and the context in which this intensive practice is taking place, in which probably some generalities can be and common threads can be applied to different meditators going through similar stages as they go through that process. And it, just a few days ago, we were talking to a senior meditation teacher who's a generation above us and has been practicing for several more decades. And he gave the comment that this kind of way of talking about Dhamma was wholly new for him. He had never really talked with his Dhamma friends in the past in this kind of way about the greater metacognitive features of the processes that you go through, and not just the micro view. So I think that's also exciting to look at those stages.
Yeah, and I think there's really very little on that out in the literature. There in my own reading, I haven't come across a lot of people who talk about these kind of like the cycle of commitment, I guess you'd call it, to meditation or to Buddhism, and how that works. And there's some early stuff, like the books that we'll talk about in the first stages, and then there's some books by monks that talk about lifelong dedication. But most of us, I think, are householders, and we are just kind of going through a process that can be kind of lonely, because there's you can talk to friends or not, it depends on the crowd you're in. But in terms of books or media or things like that, I think there's there's not a whole lot out there. I remember in my own, past, I can't remember what they call themselves now. They used to call themselves like the Dark Night of the Soul organization or something. They've created an organization. Maybe it would be helpful to have that name on hand, but they talked about people who were, starting meditation, but then coming into like serious difficulty with their practices, not just like, feeling stuck and stagnated, but just, serious mental illnesses and really kind of traumatic things happening to them, at least internally. And for me to hear that was kind of the first time I'd ever heard that talked about. When most meditation teachers don't, talk about the good things that happen from practice and what the benefits are, and if there's dangers that they talk about, it's the dangers of not practicing and not, kind of adhering to the teaching. So, to kind of hear someone talk about, hey, this path is not easy and it doesn't always go in a straight line is, for me, really comforting in a way. Like, it seems like kind of a scary thing to admit, but to know that there's other people out there that are, struggling with it and talking about it in a way that I can relate to is to me a really valuable. And so I hope, the essay can be a small contribution to that.
Yeah, and it has to be said too that it's not just that the writers wrote about this process or some of these stages. And in some ways, I'd argue they didn't. In many ways, that was your analysis and critique in bringing that to it, and the editing processes that we went through. And when you started to make yourself a fourth character, and then you talked about the modern day relevancy, that these ideas actually went more into the review than the books themselves. But it's quite interesting to think about how you've observed that meditation teachers haven't brought this to you. And when you think about the very, very recent development of formalized meditation in the West, it's all been this grand experiment. And in some ways, I think the people themselves would admit they didn't know exactly what they were doing. They were giving it their best shot. They were learning as they went along and making the best choices that they could. But many of these people were so enthusiastic and grateful and motivated about what their own practice was doing. They just, with all that enthusiasm and care, they wanted to bring it to other people. And so these aren't, in many cases, this isn't the example of, dedicated lifelong monks who've been in robes for most of their lives and, have integrated the Dhamma like deeply into their entire beings and societal interactions, but are just bringing the burst of this practice. And that's why, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, even this very senior Vipassana meditation teacher who was probably involved in some of the early days of bringing it overseas from the East himself is starting to realize, boy, I haven't thought about it in this way. So as the Dhamma gets more established here and the mindfulness movement starts to spread, these are really interesting things to start to look at what they are and understand them.
Yeah, and then of course there's two sides to the coin. I mean, the monks who have been in robes their whole lives, they have the benefit of having, senior monks who, they themselves had senior monks above them who would, are there to maintain the tradition and maintain stability. But, there's also a sense of freedom in not having, older people or older practitioners there to like kind of tell you what to do. And that's kind of what makes mindfulness in the West so exciting, or what it has been. It's definitely maturing every year and getting more stabilized and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think there's benefits to both ways. But, being a Westerner who encountered meditation in the early 2000s, I went through it, not having a lot of reference points into what I was going through. And, I think that's probably changing, but it's definitely an area that interests me. Right. Maybe we should introduce the books.
Yep, let's get right to it. So the first one we could talk about is Journey of Insight Meditation by Eric Lerner. So first off, let's get a basic overview of what happened here.
Yeah, so Eric Lerner, the book was published in 1977. I couldn't figure out when he was born, but I think he was in his mid to late 20s when he was going through these experiences. Unfortunately, there's another Eric Lerner who's also an author who seems to be a little bit more prominent. So when you search for him, all the information leads to that guy. But anyways, he was a young man when he wrote the book, and it starts off in 1972, basically when he takes his first course with Robert Hover, who was I think some kind of an engineer appointed by S.N. Goenka to teach Vipassana. And this happened in America. At the time, Lerner was married, but he was also kind of a hippie. He'd done some traveling in India and kind of in the hippie community. And he just was really enthusiastic about meditation, just had an amazing first course. and immediately started looking for a way to go to India and basically, continue meditating with Goenka. And initially, I think him and his wife were thinking of going together, but she kind of eventually just, confessed that she just wasn't really into it and that he should go by himself. And there was this really interesting scene in the early in the book where he'd been to his first course, and he was back in, I think, in Boston or in the larger city where he was living. And his wife was kind of into music, into musician there at the show. And he was just seeing this kind of bar scene with alcohol and, people just kind of partying and dancing. And he had just kind of had a switch go off where he had, a few weeks before the course, that had been his crowd. And now he was just, seeing that as an empty experience. And it was, that's an experience I think a lot of people who can relate to. Just, it's amazing how quickly, you can kind of, the veil comes off of these experiences with intoxicants and things like that. And for him, it seemed to happen quite quickly. Anyways, he quickly, gets into India, and then, sits a number of courses in India, visits Bulgaria, eventually finds his way to Sri Lanka, before he goes there, he goes to Yangon, or Rangoon, I think it was called in those days, in Burma, and sits a course at the International Meditation Center, the center that U Ba Khin founded. U Ba Khin is no longer alive at the time. I think he died in 1971. So he was just 1 or 2 years after his passing. He sits there, and then he goes on to Sri Lanka, where he sits at a monastery, basically not really taking a course, just kind of sitting in isolation for several months. Goes through some pretty intense experiences. Goes back to IMC in Yangon for a last course, and then comes back to the United States, where he kind of completes his transition. He, the book basically is him being extremely enthusiastic about meditating and just incredibly intense about it, like isolation and really, trying to meditate as many hours as he could at a time. And then when he has an experience at the end that kind of deflates him in kind of a good way. He was kind of, maybe just too puffed up in terms of ego and intensity. And he finds himself back in the United States, not really sure where he's going to go. And he, the postscript is not that long, but he does kind of get settled into a more, calm existence in a more rural area in Western Massachusetts.
So yeah, that's a good description of what went down. And I was curious about one thing. So in your review of the book, you mentioned how much you appreciate the descriptive language that Lerner used to describe the intensity of his meditative experiences. And, truth be told, if you're going to spend a book writing about intensive meditation one after the other, you'd better learn to write pretty well, because, that's the meat and substance of your book, aside from some background of personal interactions and travel and whatnot. In contrast to that, earlier you had written in the essay that there was little more tedious than hearing a meditator describe his or her experiences on the cushion. And so I was wondering what made Lerner's story and writing so compelling and stand out from the other kind of meditator telling their meditative experience on the cushion, which you find much more tedious and cringeworthy.
Yeah, and I maybe it's a personal preference. Maybe other people like to hear about other people's meditation experiences, but I think it's really difficult to put what is really almost always a purely emotional experience into words. I mean, when we write things, one of the first rules of writing is show not tell. So if you want to get a message across in whether it's a book or a TV show, you don't have a character just explain it. You have them go through an experience that kind of has that message. And with meditation, it's hard to do that because you're just sitting there with your eyes closed usually, and just things swirling around in your mind that might be the most intense experience of your entire life. But when you describe it, in a narrative, it just kind of sounds, frankly boring in a lot of ways. I think Lerner is probably the best writer of the three. He is, in my opinion, and he did go on to be a writer. He's written several, books, fiction and nonfiction. He's been a screenwriter. So I think his talents as a writer, I think he was still quite young as a writer at the time, but that is part of it. And also, he goes through some pretty kind of astounding experiences. I mean, even, I've done a fair amount of meditating and in courses and things like that, and had some intense experiences, but he has some pretty wild stories, and it's definitely fun to read them. One of them in Sri Lanka, which I quote at length in the essay, is, he is just shuts his eyes and he just feels that he's kind of in this hellscape, just surrounded by demons, and we're just lurking everywhere, and he just completely terrifying. And that's pretty interesting in and of itself. But then he says he opens his eyes and he sees these demons just sitting in front of him on the bed and around him everywhere, and he just doesn't know what to do, so he just shuts his eyes and continues to meditate. And wow, that's pretty wild. And there's some other stories of him meditating in just huge thunderstorms with rain, and that kind of really syncing up with what he's going through internally, all that stuff, which is, quite exciting. And one of the other books that describes meditating a fair amount, but just kind of, is pretty mild, and it just, says it felt peaceful or felt, intense or things like that, but it's not really focused on the actual experience of meditating. So yeah, he did a great job just kind of bringing the actual, especially in these really intense kind of, make or break moments in meditation, which I think a lot of people who have done retreats are familiar with.
Right. And I guess when you're talking about the more cringeworthy experiences of hearing a meditator tell a story, it might be more in the line of like a first-time student completing a 10-day course and then meticulously having to tell people on day 10 every experience he went through on every day and what he felt about it, or someone, now with the advent of YouTube, someone just doing a selfie, turning the camera around, and experiences that were incredibly personal and important to them, describing in detail what they went through. And it's hard to follow along with that. And that's quite a different landscape than someone who is leaving everything behind in the 70s to live alone or nearly alone at a Sri Lankan monastery, and is confronting literal demons and writing about it in very eloquent and professional ways as he's describing what he went through.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't want to rip on these people who, to talk about their experiences or post them on YouTube too much. I mean, I definitely understand that, your first meditation course, or, even your third or fifth or 10th, can be one of the most profound, difficult experiences of your life. And that, is certainly something that people want to express and share with other people. But I do think it's a hard thing to do. Like, it's not like, being in a war or, participating in some kind of sports championship where, there's a real narrative you can follow. It's a harder thing to depict. And, I think that's one of the strengths of Lerner's book.
Yeah. And, thank God there was no YouTube or anything else in 2001, 2002 when we took our courses, because, definitely speaking personally, I was one of those students after the first couple courses, and I just didn't have a media bullhorn to be able to project my story. So today, first-time meditators aren't so lucky.
Yeah, well, I'm thankful there wasn't social media around in my youth for a lot of other reasons as well.
Right. So Lerner, he gives vivid detail in describing a number of things in his book. He describes his mindset, his travel in Asia in the 70s, experiences under different meditation teachers, but we don't really learn that much about his life before, aside from this marriage that's in the process of failing, nor after. And what's interesting about that is that so much of the way that you approach this essay that you wrote was about one's full story and trajectory in the meditative experience. And this is the briefest snapshot of the three of them, I would argue, at least. So how did that leave you as a reader, feeling that you were led on this brief and intense spiritual journey and somewhat travelogue, but not really know the full range of a story?
Yeah, well, he gives a tiny proscript at the end, which is really quite small. And you just kind of, you're left feeling like, I wonder how this goes, because it's been such a book of transformations. Like, he's gone from, a hippie to a really intense meditator to, married to not married. And then, at the end of the book, he's kind of this calm guy. I talk about him like fixing this stone wall in Western Massachusetts with a cow next to him. And it's this really kind of peaceful, solid kind of image that he gives. And he goes up to this meditation course, actually, that was taught by Joseph Goldstein, who's quite a well-known teacher now. And hasn't just kind of, you see him as a more mature student at the time. He's not, among the newer students who are just kind of furiously meditating in the hall. He's kind of on the fringes and just more confident and things like that. But still, it's only, I don't know how long after he came back from Asia, a year or maybe a little more, but not very long. And you just wonder, like, well, where did this go? Like, what is he like in 5 years or 10 years? And there's a little bit online that I found. He, at some point he moves to California, starts writing other things. So yeah, actually, interestingly enough, he pretty recently published a book about Leonard Cohen, who is a fairly famous musician who died fairly recently, and they were good friends through Zen meditation, and so apparently Lerner went on to, I don't know if he left Vipassana or what, or if he stopped practicing. It's not clear, but he definitely developed an interest in Zen and was a part of that community in California. But at the same time, was a householder throughout his life, or he's still alive, rather, I should say. Maybe if he's listening, like, hello there. But was a householder. Didn't, in the other book, one of them becomes a monk, and in another book becomes a pretty serious meditation teacher. So, it's interesting that he, went on from this really profound experience that was so profound that he wrote a book about it, to being a householder who was involved in meditation, but I guess not, dedicated full time to it, for sure. It's hard to say definitively because I don't know, but that sure seems to be the case. And that's interesting to me because it somewhat follows my own trajectory. I had a period of really intensive meditation, and as I've gone into middle age, in my early 40s now, that's become a lot less intense, though my interest hasn't dropped. And I know what that has felt like, and I know what it's felt like in a few other people I've talked to. But I'm kind of left with wondering, like, how did that go for Lerner? And I wish I kind of knew more about that.
Right. And you reference towards the end of the book, Lerner comes back to the US and he's struggling with his identity. He's all but being accused of being emasculated by his friends. And you go into your own adjustment in returning from Japan to Montana in your mid-20s. And not just returning to a different culture, because you'd been away from American culture for a while at that point, but also coming back with this new identity you're taking on as a meditator. So how did your experience feel similar to what Lerner described?
Yeah, it was hard. I think I was less expressive than Lerner. I was comfortable talking about my experiences with friends that I was close with, but if I was around other people, I would kind of just maintain the mode. I didn't change the way I dressed, really. I wasn't proselytizing about meditation and that. So I kind of feel my personality made my adjustment a little bit easier. Pretty soon after I came back from Japan, I got a job as a firefighter, a wildland firefighter in Montana for the summer. So I was around a lot of real kind of good old boy Montana fellas, young, slightly younger than me at the time. I was in my mid-20s, and a lot of them were in their early 20s, and real kind of manly men, like to hunt and hike, and pretty strong physically. And it was hard to be around them. I just didn't have the same priorities as them or interests as them and things like that. Soon after that, I ended up moving to Hawaii and was in school for Chinese medicine, and that crowd was really welcoming to the kind of person I was becoming. So that kind of softened my adjustment, I think, back to America. But the first year or two kind of after that, I think is really hard. And it's a real test to your dedication, and I think it feels really good if you can pass that test, if you can integrate meditation into your life and do it in a healthy way that, as much as possible maintains relationships from before. I mean, some of them might be toxic, right, and you need to cut them out. But if you're able to integrate that, I think for me at least, it was a great feeling of achievement. And I get slightly that impression at the end of Lerner's book, because he's, kind of comes back and he's real skinny, and he's, just doesn't really know who he is. And then, at the end of the book, he's kind of seems really comfortable in his own skin. And I think that's kind of a real crucial phase in people's journeys.
Right. And I think there was a line you wrote in there that was quite interesting, where it was like you have this vision in this other way that comes partly through Asian culture and partly through meditation, that there's another way to be a man, that you don't have to be aggressive and macho and this American style of being a man. And yet you have this intellectual understanding, this experiential understanding, but you don't really know who you are and how you're going to look that way. So it's this awkward period of experimentation, of trying to figure out, well, I know I don't want to be like I was before, and I know I don't want to be like the model I'm seeing now, but I don't really know what that looks like. So what you're really looking at is a lack of integration. And funny enough, this came up for me in watching the documentary about Mr. Rogers, because the TV personality for children who did the children's shows, there was just a beautiful comment at the end of that where I don't remember who it was that was saying it, someone that was associated with the show or a child who grew up, but basically said, like, Mr. Rogers was the only example that I had at that time all around me that there was another way to be a man, that you could be gentle and caring and calm and kind, and you could still very much be a man in that body. And that's different than integrating Asian culture or gender stereotypes or meditation into your being. But it's also, it just highlights the conditioning of thinking that there's just one way to be and kind of adapting to that, even though it's not comfortable. And then when you see that that's not the only way, it's a little bit awkward of trying to figure out, okay, well, how do I kind of got this, but I don't really know how to bring it together and make sense of it and then be comfortable in my own skin.
Yeah, it can be extremely awkward and, difficult to look back on, just because, of course, you're not going to get it right on the first try. I did find an interview with Lerner from quite a bit later. I can't remember when exactly he gave it. I think in the 2000s sometime. But he, the interviewer asked him about the book he wrote on meditation and Buddhism, and one of the things he says, it's good to do it when you're young because you don't really mind sounding foolish. Or I can't remember exactly how he put it, but he used the word foolish, and I really related to that because there's kind of this unfortunate consequence that when you're most passionate about something, it tends to be when you know the least about it. When you have
Right.
the first few years as a meditator, you're so into it and you just think it's the greatest thing and you want to tell everybody about it, but you don't really have your identity or all the thoughts sorted out. And so you just come across sounding kind of like a fool a lot of times. And then, as you get more comfortable, you don't really feel the need to kind of do that anymore. But so it's this kind of unfortunate consequence. But still, there's definitely value in Lerner's book. I think he was more self-aware than a lot of people, probably more than I am. I mean, he writes kind of critically about himself. He makes himself look, foolish in the moment, and it's pretty admirable that he has that self-awareness, I guess I'd say.
Yeah, it's funny that you keep coming back to this word foolish, because there was one line that I took out of your essay that I wanted to touch upon, and it's a line where you use the word foolish in relation to Lerner's persona at the time. So you wrote that, I admit to thinking Lerner came across as impressionable and sometimes foolish, but I'm glad he wrote his book when the experiences were fresh and he had the courage to present them honestly. So what was it particularly that you enjoyed about Lerner being impressionable and sometimes foolish, but having the courage to reveal it and present it honestly? What was appealing about that style for you?
Well, in a way, it was kind of a trip down memory lane. I mean, when you because it's funny because he's so intense about meditation. Like the things that he goes through at each course are just brutal, like not only mentally but physically. I mean, he talks about getting sick at one course in India, and it's just awful. and so he's going through these just like astoundingly difficult experiences. And then like at the end of the book, like he's dialed his meditation way back, and the tone is so much more peaceful, which is just this kind of funny thing. Is like, wait a minute, aren't you supposed to be peaceful when you're meditating? But in fact, it's when he dials it back and kind of lets go of things that he's at his most peaceful. And so it's just kind of this, and I totally remember that. Like I remember myself, in the first few years after meditating and just kind of like thinking like, I've just got to throw myself into this as much as I can, and always like searching for these really, kind of difficult, intense experiences. And if I'm not having that, it means I'm not, progressing. And, there's those experiences, I don't want to discount them. They're valuable for sure. And I think in some ways I can criticize myself now to not seeking them out enough. But, to kind of think that those are, that's what you need to do kind of from the moment you encounter meditation until the moment that either you obtain enlightenment, you die, is just kind of, kind of interesting to look at that now. It's like, wait a minute, isn't this supposed to be a path of peace and moderation and, middle path and all that? And, when you read Lerner's book, it's really not. It's a war zone basically from beginning to end. but at the same time, he's like, the arc of the book kind of is he gets to Sri Lanka and he's really just kind of going at it, just so hardcore, and he has an experience that he believes is full enlightenment, and he believes, okay, like I've tasted it, I stream entry or what, I don't think he uses those words, but he's, this is what the Buddha was talking about, and I have achieved it, not permanently, but I've tasted it. And he goes back to IMC, where he has these teachers, Mother Sayama was a successor of U Ba Khin, and some other people there that he really respected. And he's like, I just kind of want to go back and tell him what I've achieved and thank him. And, this will be a great capstone on my trip. And he goes back, and basically they immediately dismiss him. They can tell right away that this guy has not achieved enlightenment just, by, who he is, his presence, and he tries to describe it, and they dismiss him and just be like, okay, just keep practicing. And he's like, no, wait a minute, you didn't hear me, I really achieved this. And then they kind of just really shoot him down, and he's the one telling the story, so he's the one saying, like, they shot me down and it crushed me. And that, I think, is really admirable, because they, to be able to, it must have been incredibly painful, and to be able to take that in, accept it. He could have just said, like, they don't know what they're talking about. I achieved this, and this is, my achievement. But, he realized his mistake and his ego, and he took it in, and he, integrated it into what ended up, in a, I don't know how much longer, but when he got back to America and settled into a more, what seems to be a healthier, more integrated practice. And so, yeah, I really admire kind of the ability to do that in a shorter time. Like, I think, it's taken me a lot longer to kind of process my own, kind of attachments to that kind of practice.
Right. But that being said, as you write about later on, what happens next? Like, he did write a book, and he did want to leave the reader somewhat satisfied that there was some kind of resolution or some kind of clarity in how things got tied up and what happened next. And, who knows the shape that life really took. Although that's not so much embedded in the pages, that really goes along with, your critique of how you were reading the book and then the spin you put on the essay. So let's get to that a little later on, because that will tie up the books together. But moving on, let's get to One Night Shelter. This is by Scott DuPrez. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name, who starts out the book as Scott and ends up the book in robes under a name of Bhikkhu Yogavacara Rahula. So with this book, unlike the other two, so much of it captures the protagonist's full journey prior to when he learned meditation. So much so that you mention in your essay, it could almost be like a travelogue on its own. If so, it would remind me of something like the famous book Howard Mark, a British guy who was a drug runner, wrote a book called Mr. Nice. If only Howard Mark had found Dhamma instead of becoming a major drug runner and ending up in jail. But first, let's recount where Scott's journey took him before meditation ever came on the scene. So laying out who this guy was and where he came from and what his whole trip was about. What did he have to say?
Yeah, well, he actually does have a drug running stage himself. He was a really, really bad drug runner, probably good for his life, but he does try his hand at it. So, I mean, the book, really gives a background. He starts off, he's born in Southern California, born in 1948. So, most of the book is like around 72 to 75. So he was, in his early 20s, basically, early to mid 20s. And, he grows up in Southern California. It sounds like a pretty middle class upbringing, turns into a kind of surfer guy who likes drinking and smoking pot. Ends up joining the army and gets sent to Vietnam. And that is really not a very intense experience, except for the fact that he's stoned pretty much all the time. He's not in combat. He's kind of has a technical job. And so he's in Europe for a while with the army, and Vietnam for somewhat, and finally gets out. And then he really gets serious about being a hippie. And he's a really, proper hippie. He's smoked pot all the time. He takes LSD a lot. Like probably hundreds of times in his life, definitely just all the time he's popping acid. And, he takes one trip to Europe in the summer, really likes it, spends time in Morocco, and then makes a plan next year in 1972. He's going to take a big trip with some friends and just, kind of drop out of college and just, travel for as long as they can. And, when he leaves in 1972, he ends up not coming back to the U.S. for 5 years. And when he comes back, he's a monk. And so it's a pretty major turning point in his life, this leaving for Europe. But his idea when he leaves, he's got, I think, 1,000 tabs of acid that he packs in his suitcase or his sock, wraps up in a sock in his suitcase, and they fly to Sweden. And he thinks, okay, I'm going to sell this acid, and that'll fund my trip. And okay, that sounds like a good idea. And he immediately meets this drug dealer. I think he had a connection with this other hippie drug dealer, and basically gives him most of his stash to sell, and then says, okay, I'm going to go cruise around, Sweden and Norway for a while. And he goes camping and hitchhiking, comes back, and the drug dealer is kind of ditched town, or said, I can't remember what exactly why, but basically loses like a huge chunk of his LSD stash that he had, paid for and expected to fund. So that's his first failure as a drug runner. And then, yeah, him and his buddies just start traveling. They head south through Europe. He still has some acid left, so he ends up selling that at a music festival. And they have, different adventures. They get to Spain. They take a boat over the Canary Islands, where they live for a long time in this little house and kind of get to know the locals, and basically living with a bunch of hippies in this house on the Canary Islands for several months or so. And eventually they get tired of that, and he takes off to Morocco, travels through Morocco, smoking a ton of hash. They kind of go through North Africa, get on a ferry to Greece, and then they start traveling overland towards their eventual goal is to get to India. And they go through Turkey, they get to Iran, and then they get to Afghanistan. And it's interesting in this time, they're traveling and they're just chilling, like they're just loving it. They go really rural places, really, just kind of hanging out, staying with people's houses. I mean, I just couldn't imagine doing that today, especially in some place like Afghanistan. It's, a different time, wouldn't be safe to do that in Afghanistan today. So that's, definitely something that shows the time it was. But he gets to Afghanistan, and now he comes to his second attempt to be a drug runner. They pack up a bunch of hash in, I think it was this crazy idea. Like maybe it wasn't him, but his friend who has the hash block sewn into this kind of exotic vest that he gets made for him, and otherwise has another, couple pounds in his backpack. And they end up getting on this bus for the border to India, or maybe, sorry, Pakistan, I think it is. But the bus takes a long time, and it's really hot, and the hash ends up just like starting to smell. So they just have this, they're just reeking of hash once they get to the border. And immediately the border guard is like, hey, like, you guys smell like hash. Can I search you? And they're like, well, okay. And they search them and bust them immediately. And so they get thrown in jail. And they get thrown in jail in Afghanistan. And, I think right now that would be just incredibly terrifying, but it's a pretty easy thing for them. They kind of chill. It's not all that pleasant, but it's pretty mellow in this jail. And they stay there for a few weeks, and they have their trial, and they're guilty, and they say they're sorry. And the government, puts them on a plane back to Greece, and that's kind of it. And it's kind of, representative of his whole life up to them. Like, he's just had a real kind of easy way. Like, things, you don't always go exactly how he wants, but, he joins the army in 1967, and he, basically has no risk of ever getting a bullet thrown his way. And then he, has, bringing drugs on a plane to Sweden, bringing drugs across the border and getting caught, and, never really has a big, problem happen to him. And so the whole time he just continues to smoke and do drugs. And anyways, eventually he makes it to India, and this is where he starts getting into meditation. Actually, in Nepal, he starts hearing about meditation courses, Buddhism courses, and he takes his first course in Nepal. It's a 4-week course with a Tibetan Lama, and that is kind of a life-changing event for him.
Yeah, so leading up to the time of where he gets his first taste of Dhamma, there's this whole travelogue. I don't know how much of the book it is. It's certainly...
I mean, it's like almost a 400-page book, and it's about half of it.
Right. So he's describing in all this detail of his travels and these experiences in the 70s, these places that to us are quite exotic. So what was your experience as a reader and a meditator going through so much of this journey before any notion of Dhamma kicked in?
Yeah, it was really interesting because, like you mentioned, it could have been a travel log. Like, I mean, it's great stories. Like, he takes this epic trip, and it's, has some funny, great stories, interesting stuff happens. He could have ended it, he could have just said, okay, I got deported from Afghanistan. I'm going home. I'm going to get a job. And that's kind of the end of my hippie era. And, it would have been a pretty interesting story. But he's just always on drugs. Like he's just always smoking weed and he's always taking acid. And he's writing about it. And he's writing about it. And I think the book was published in the late 80s. And, he's been a monk at the time for 10 years or so. And so obviously, like he's left that life behind. And it was really interesting to see how a monk of 10 years was going to approach that narrative. Like how are you going to write about this person who you were, you were, it's not like he was an enormous addict, that was just causing major havoc in his life. Like he was drunk and it caused him some problems for sure, but it was pretty minor stuff, in the grand scheme of things. So how is he going to write about it? And he really does a great job of balancing, like, he's not didactic, like he's not constantly telling you like, oh, like I was this fool, like all wrapped up in intoxicants and just ruining my life. Like, no, he tells stories and he says, yeah, like I took acid in the desert and it was really beautiful and I was really chill and it was a nice experience. And, he's really honest, like that's how it felt at the time. And, every now and again, when things go a little bit awry from him, he'll kind of point out, like, that my mind was still attached to this kind of need for sensory experiences, and this kind of manifested in the eventual suffering in this moment. And he'll give a little blurb about, like, maybe a little Dhamma perspective, but for the most part, he just kind of tells the story. And it goes from smoking weed in California to smoking weed in Vietnam to smoking weed in Europe to North Africa to the Near East to India. And, you don't really come across as this, a person who's glorifying it, in any way, but, don't really see that he's condemning it either. And it's really interesting too, because we're kind of jumping ahead, but when he ordains, he gives a speech like before all of these monks in Sri Lanka. And I think the American ambassador to Sri Lanka is there, or maybe it's just the consulate, or, it's a big deal to have a foreigner ordain at the time. And, in his speech, he talks a lot about, the Buddhist teachings and how much they meant to him and all that stuff. And all that's quite interesting. But he also says, hey, like I used to do a lot of acid. Those experiences really helped open the door for me for like getting into Buddhism. And it was just kind of amazing to think of him like saying that in that setting. Mm-hmm. And, it's really honest too, because it's true. Like, and if you talk to people, meditators, a lot of them have similar experiences, but it also, a lot of people who get into Buddhism end up stopping intoxicants and seeing them as the, not really the good path to go on. And so being able to kind of treat your past as something that was what it was, and not, wallowing in condemnation, but at the same time, not glorifying, is a real fine needle to thread, and he does a great job of it.
Right. So when he got ordained and gave that speech, wasn't there another note in the book about some of his friends back home celebrating or honoring his ordination by taking acid at the time that the ceremony happened or something like that?
Yeah, that's a great thing, because he decides to ordain, and so he actually writes a letter or a telegram or something back to his friends in California, his buddies in California. He actually says in the book this was going to trip them out or something like that. He basically says, like, they know they're going to read this and be like, whoa, can you get a load of what Scott's doing now, man? And sure enough, like, they sent a telegram back, which arrived like the day before he was going to ordain, I'm pretty sure, or the day or something. And like, he was going to get ordained on a full moon day. I think it was an important Buddhist holiday. And so they're like, when that full moon is out, we're going to be out in the desert taking acid in your honor. and which is hilarious, in a Buddhist context, but it's also really cool because at the time he was really touched by it. He said it brings tears to his eyes, and which is just really awesome, I think. I mean, mm-hmm. He, like, these are his friends, like these are the people mm-hmm. he grew up with, and they're important to him. And for him to kind of be able to see across, what is now a pretty significant divide between them, in a lot of ways, like the life he's adopting and the life they're still living, to, have that bond of friendship is really beautiful. And I think is one thing for me was really important that I achieved when I was, starting to meditate, because some people have bad lives and that they want to kind of escape from, and meditation can help them do that. And that's great. And I definitely wanted, meditation to help me escape from suffering in certain ways, but I liked my life. My family was loving and good. And I had a lot of good friends that I didn't want to lose. And it was really important to me to be able to maintain those relationships while meditating. And that was kind of a test for me. It was like, if I'm not able to do this, like if this kind of tradition or this practice makes me lose friends that I value, like maybe it's not for me. And so I was, for the most part, I was able to do that. It wasn't without difficulty, but I was able to do that. And so I really appreciated seeing that in him, just kind of this thought that, like, yes, you're taking on a new phase in life that is going to be quite different from what you used to be, but that doesn't negate everything that you used to be at the same time.
That's really interesting. That's an interesting way to look at it, because the way a lot of young Westerners who go into meditation and get into it really strongly, I think a not so uncommon way to look at it is that much of what they were doing, how they were thinking, how they were living, who they were associating with was just really not correct or very conducive to spiritual growth. And this isn't even talking about people that were, necessarily in bad situations or really in toxic environments, but just looking at even like, I don't want to be around anyone who's drinking even a glass of wine, or, not following the precepts, or not on the cushion meditating, trying to gain spiritual growth. And so in some ways there's kind of a disassociation or a separation that takes place when the lives start to diverge. But it's interesting to hear from you how, as you took up a practice, the ability to maintain many things that were happening in your life, but yet enhance your experience and relationship with them was important. That's something I actually haven't heard before.
Yeah. And it's not like it all went smoothly too. I can definitely identify with the people who, say, like, I don't want any contact with alcohol and things like that. And not that it's totally resolved either. Like, I still to this day, like, I'll go back to Montana and hang out with family and friends, and someone will want to go to a bar, and it's not a place I'd prefer to be, but, like, go along with it. And how long do I stay? And it's an ongoing thing for sure. And that's, but especially in the beginning, it's hard because you don't really know that it's okay to kind of feel uncomfortable, and it's okay to kind of compromise in certain situations. And so, yeah, that's part of that transition that we were talking about earlier as well.
Right. And it should be said, this is a topic that's being said between two people who used to, before meditation, stay up in Roppongi in Tokyo until the sun came up, and maybe remember half of that night if we were lucky. So this is coming from two people that have had an association with alcohol definitely before, and yet the power of meditation was so strong that whatever experiences and revelry we had with each other and out on the town in the past, through meditation, those experiences just were no longer of any interest, and they have not been to this day. And I think the most that you and I exchange on that matter these days is where to get the best 0.00% non-alcoholic beer. So.
Yeah. Well, thank God for that.
Right. Going back to a couple of things you said a few minutes ago, I want to comment that I do think that this is the funniest of the three books. There's a lot of places of humor in here, whether intentional or unintentional. He paints this colorful picture of one event after another, coming in contact with this friend or that friend, going to this place, having this happening. And there's also this sense of, like, spaciousness in the writing, where he doesn't feel in a hurry to get anywhere. And that's also, so as I was reading it, it was kind of like enjoying his journey and knowing he was going to get somewhere at some point, but really letting him take the time, which is very different from Lerner, that was just full of these really intense and powerful experiences that all hit him at once. And it's interesting as well, looking at the background of drugs that he came from. And you're correct that a lot of Western meditators do come from an experience of intoxication, of using intoxicants and psychedelics and alcohol and other kinds of substances in that way, and then realizing those only take them so far and looking for something else. I just want to share one story that my co-host Zach Hessler has shared before. I might get a few details wrong, so apologies for that, but it is the very best story that I've heard of a meditator coming from a background of intoxicants and substances. This guy that Zach knew was doing some kind of psychedelic. It might have been LSD or something, mushrooms. I don't know what it was. But in whatever hallucination he was having, he was in the most extraordinarily peaceful setting he had ever found. It was just idyllic, and everything about it was just pure peace. And he sat down on the bank of a river and had never felt that way in his life. And a huge giant came walking towards him and sat down with him, folded his legs, and they were just kind of sitting there together. And the giant turned to him and said, "This is pretty peaceful, isn't it?" And the guy said, "Yeah, it is." And then the giant said back to him, "You will not be able to come to this place again until you've completed 100,000 hours of meditation." And poof, the whole thing disappeared. And that's what he was left with. And from that, and apologies again, I might have missed some of the story from how Zach has rendered it, but that's the essence of it. And from my memory of it, the scene just disappeared in a puff of smoke. It went away forever. And from that moment on, he stopped doing drugs and found a Vipassana course and went on the path of meditation. And I don't know how many hours he's achieved up to that point, but certainly, that is a background people come from. And that gets into the question I want to ask is, you reference how he described in the first half of the book, these experiences that he was having, the spaciousness, as he was progressing through from one place to another, not really knowing where he was going to find or where he was going to end up. And also choosing as a monk, writing about it, to relay his experiences from that time without a heavy sense of judgment or superimposing the ethical life that he was living. And you wrote, quote, "This authentic approach to his younger self's journey, rather than imposing retroactive judgments, results in a portrayal that shows how his then mind perceived and was affected and ultimately changed by these experiences, allowing the reader to appreciate what ultimately landed him into a spiritual practice." So why did this way of writing work for you?
Yeah, well, he starts off and he just kind of tells it how it is. I mean, the book is not like a real lyrical account. Like, it's kind of different than Lerner. Like, it's not really dramatic. I mean, there's definitely, I mean, you're right, it's funny. There's some funny scenes and there's some definitely interesting things happen, but it's, he lives a pretty mellow life kind of on purpose. Like, he, even once he starts to be a monk, like he's intense about it and he's serious about it, but it still, his approach is kind of happy-go-lucky, and the whole book kind of reads like that. And I'm a different person than I was, in my late teens and early 20s. When I was into alcohol and drugs, and like I said before, is not a major addict and didn't really cause major disasters in my life. And we don't really get those tales very often. You hear a lot about people who go way too far and then they get out of it and their life gets better, and those are inspiring stories, but they, you're kind of left with it was when they were on drugs, it was a bad time. And when they got off drugs, it was a better time. And, that narrative doesn't hold as strongly, I think, for a lot of people. And that's kind of clear in Bhikkhu Rahula's book and in my story as well, is, we left behind that kind of lifestyle, but at the same time, it's kind of hard to say that I regret it. Like, I wouldn't really say I look back on that time with a lot of shame, with a lot of regret. Certainly sometimes incidents that happened that I wish hadn't happened. And I'm happy that I'm not doing those things anymore. But at the same time, it's just like that, that's who I was at the time. And that's like what was going on. And what else can I expect? And I handled it in a way that was, reasonable, I guess. And I think, it's good to be forgiving of your past self. You don't look back at yourself as a 6-year-old child playing with Star Wars figurines and say, "Oh, what an immature little person I was then." That's just who you were at the time. And I think that applies to adulthood in a similar way. Sometimes we don't let it apply to adulthood because you're expected to be mature once you reach a certain stage. But that was just who I was, and that's what I was going through. And not that I, as soon as I found a better way, I immediately popped out of it. Like, it took quite a while, and there's definitely, ways right now that I could probably be living better that I'm not doing, and all that. So it's not like there's, living without regrets and not looking with a critical eye at all. But, it's nice to have a narrative of a guy who just, went through a life that he thought was, how he wanted to live. And it was being reasonably successful for him, although there was a time in an Afghan prison. But otherwise he was having a good enough time. But at the same time, there was something kind of missing. And he was once he kind of found that, once he kind of heard about meditation, And once he kind of discovered what was possible through there, like he left behind his previous life pretty quickly. Like within a few months, he was not doing intoxicants. He was meditating extremely seriously. He was not really involved in any more sexual practice after a couple other experiences. And yeah, he just pretty much, and he's pretty sure right almost from the get go that he wanted to be a dedicated Buddhist. And not too long after that, he was pretty much knew he wanted to be a monk, and that's what he did. And he's still a monk to this day. So good on him.
Right. And it's funny that he goes deeper than any of the others, just in terms of the other two writers, just in the sense that he became a lifelong monk from this experience and is still in robes today. However, what's interesting is, according to at least the written accounts that we have before us, he also seems like the one of the three that has the most resistance on his path in getting there, or at least he describes the most resistance. He takes these gradual steps towards further renunciation. He had cultivated this whole hippie persona, and you might laugh about it now, but it was actually extremely important to him. I mean, the accoutrements and the philosophy and the lifestyle of being a hippie and embracing that as identity was very difficult to give up, and happened only kind of one stage after another. And then also giving up the intoxicants was the hardest thing for him. People have different things that are difficult to give up on the path, especially if they're becoming a monk. For some people, it's sex. For some people, it's food. For some people, it's independence. For some, it's entertainment or creativity. So for him, it was very much intoxication, and it was a little bit of a one step forward, two steps back kind of thing, until he finally shed it and got to the end of where he was. So what was your feeling as a reader in following this and seeing this direction? He was definitely being pulled in like a magnet, but it wasn't a smooth transition that wasn't without some kind of resistance and some kind of pushback at times.
Yeah, well, it's funny. In his first course, at the very end of the course, they have this ceremony where you can take the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts. And actually, it's kind of an interesting ceremony. I've never heard of anything like it. Maybe it's common in Tibetan Buddhism, but they kind of just say, do whatever you want. If you want to take the 3 refuges, do that. If you want to take 5 precepts, do that. If you want to take 1, if you want 2 or 3. And so he thought really hard about what he wanted to do. And he realized he wanted to be a Buddhist. So he took the 3 refuges, but he wasn't sure that he was ready to give up lying or intoxicants. Or sorry, not lying. He wasn't sure if he was ready to give up intoxicants or sex or lying. Yeah, there was 3. So he was only going to give up killing and stealing, basically. And so he took those 2 precepts. I'm sorry, I might be wrong. It might be he took 3 and he waited for 2, or he took 2 and waited for 3. But anyways, it was just an interesting process of being very deliberate. Like, okay, I'm ready for this, but I'm not ready for that. And that's why, yeah, like I would actually call it a smooth transition, but it wasn't necessarily a fast transition, because he doesn't seem to have a lot of conflict about it. Like he gets done with the course and he goes back to Kathmandu, and he wants to feel like what it's like to get high, like after this experience, and so he does it. And he has a few other opportunities to do that in the next coming months. He takes acid in Goa and has some sexual experiences in Goa, and you get the sense that, okay, like he's not, he hasn't just dropped it, like a rock, but at the same time, like it just doesn't really seem like it's a struggle for him. Like he just kind of feels like he really knows himself in a way. Like he's just like, I'm not ready for this yet, and I'll try it a few more times just to kind of make sure I'm done with it. And then he does, and then he's like, okay, I'm done with it now, and just kind of this kind of slow and inexorable. Sorry, I don't know how to say that word. I can write it, but just inevitable pathway to robes. And maybe he left the struggle out of his narrative, and it was a more difficult thing, but that's how it comes across in the book.
So when looking at like Eric Lerner and Scott DuPrez, both of them came from the hippie trail, in contrast to John Coleman, who we're going to talk about next. And they also follow a somewhat similar path and where they go and who they learn under. Scott, I think, was a few years earlier. But that's as far as their similarities go. What differences or distinctions did you find in their personalities or styles or experience?
Bhikkhu Rahula, just way more laid back. Like even his meditation experiences, I mean, these are obviously dramatic things that are happening to him changes the course of his life. But the way he just describes it in a much more relaxed manner, so you just don't get the impression that he's just going through these just hugely dramatic things that Lerner is. I mean, they do have several experiences that are similar. They both, started out with Goenka. Actually, Bhikkhu Rahula didn't truly start out with Goenka. He started out with Tibetan Buddhism, and then his next course was Goenka. But that was like an early influence for sure. They both mostly stayed in Theravada. They both, were in India, and they both were in. Actually, I don't think Lerner went to Nepal, but they both went to Sri Lanka. They actually both met with this German monk. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it, but it's Nyana Ponika.
Right.
Yeah, he's a German monk. He's passed away now, but he was elderly even then when they met him. But they both met with him in Sri Lanka. I think Lerner was more on a short-term schedule, and that kind of, you can feel that in his book. Like, he doesn't say like, my ticket back is such and such a date, but like he was married, and that relationship is kind of looming throughout the book, and it's part of his narrative. Whereas Rahula left, and he was just gone, and that's basically, he didn't have any plans on coming back, and didn't necessarily feel a need to get back to anything. He had his parents back in the States, but he really didn't feel a huge attachment to being back there, anytime soon. So I think that, he was just much more able to kind of follow his interests and take time to let things play out.
Right. Right. So it's also seen comparing the difference of someone that is ultimately choosing to stay within the monkhood and someone that is having a very intensive meditation experience, series of meditative experiences on courses, and for whom the Dhamma and meditation practice is going to be important for the rest of his life, but is also coming at the end of the book, transitioning back into that society, as we talked about. So interesting, different paths. And the third path we're going to look at is The Quiet Mind by John Coleman. This took place, I think, about a decade earlier than the others. And John Coleman was a very different kind of guy as well. He was a former CIA operative. And before you get into the overview of the book, it's interesting just to reference, I just read this book that came out this year, last month, called Cold War Monks. And it actually goes into detail about how the CIA during this time, I don't know if John Coleman was involved or to what extent. Certainly the book takes place after he left the CIA. But during this period, the CIA was indeed influencing the Sanghas all over Southeast Asia in the 1950s because they felt that a strong conservative and traditional monkhood was a good bulwark against communism, and that would not want to see communism come to a Buddhist society. So they wanted to have a very strong Buddhist society. And the way you do that is you have a very strong conservative monkhood. However, as we mentioned, it's uncertain if Coleman had any involvement in that. Moving from there, let's get to who John Coleman was and what account he relayed in the book.
Yeah, so Coleman was a bit older. I think, let's see, he was born in 1930, so that would make him 18 years older than Bhikkhu Rahula, and probably something similar to Lerner. So, a previous generation. He was too young to have fought in World War II, but he did fight in Korea. Actually, interestingly enough, he had a role in the Japanese war crime trials, according to a comment that we got on Facebook by a guy who knows him, which is incredibly fascinating. Just a major event, and this is kind of a theme for his life. He was kind of on the ground, meeting a lot of important figures. And yeah, his story gets started in the mid 50s, I think. It's funny, none of these books were all that great about giving exact dates. They gave a few dates, but it's not totally clear when exactly things started. I know it's in the mid 50s that he was in Thailand. And he was still a CIA agent, I believe undercover. I think he had some kind of cover job while in Bangkok. And yeah, he basically goes through the book kind of as an exploration for the quiet mind. He's seeking the quiet mind is the theme of the book. And he starts off in Thailand. He has these monk, Thai Buddhist and Thai monk friends who they start out, the first chapter is about hypnosis, and then hypnosis and ESP, and he's doing these, he's visiting Duke University in the States, doing these kind of wacky card tricks where people are trying to guess the shapes on the other side, kind of like in Ghostbusters. And And so it's just kind of like, wow, like, okay, hypnosis, here we go. And they're talking about mind control of things like that. And, it's associated with Buddhism, but it's not really very Buddhist. But eventually he gets into more Buddhism, and he goes to a course in Thailand. He's supposed to be there for, I don't remember if it was 2 weeks or 10 days or what it was, but he basically is only there for a few nights, and it's just too intense. And he doesn't really explain why, but he leaves quite early. I think the next year, or not too long after that, he goes to Burma and sits at a course at IMC with U Ba Khin, and U Ba Khin is still alive then. It's probably late 50s by now, and has a good experience there. Then he spends the next portion of the book just kind of exploring a lot of spirituality in India. He goes to northern India, meets Tibetan Buddhists, talks about Tantra. I mean, in line with the rest of the crazy experiences, he meets some pretty amazing figures. Like one of them, which he talks about a lot, is Krishnamurti, who isn't really a Buddhist or a Hindu figure, but kind of, definitely within the Eastern realm of spiritual teachers. And he has this kind of wild chance meeting on a plane with him, where he basically sees this interesting looking Indian guy, and ends up switching seats to talk with him, and ends up being Krishnamurti, which is pretty amazing. And then when he goes to North India, he just ends up meeting Tenzing, which is the Sherpa that was the first person to scale Mount Everest with Sir Edmund Hillary. So it's just like, wow, like, all these amazing figures that he's just kind of running into, U Ba Khin being among them for our crowd. He spends some time in Japan, where he meets, the great teacher Daisetsu Suzuki, and visits the Zen monastery. And then kind of towards the end of the book, he goes back to England, and or not back to England, sorry, he's American, but he marries an English woman, a British woman, and they move to England. And he encounters the Maharishi, talks a lot about that. He tries a little bit of transcendental meditation. And by now we're in the late 60s. So he's talking about, the Beatles and that whole craze. And he does a little bit of experimentation. He goes to a couple Quaker meetings. He goes to a couple spiritualist meetings, which is the kind of I think they're kind of defunct now, but they were, really into seances and speaking with spirits of the dead and things like that. He also visits a Benedictine monastery and has some conversations with those people. And then at the end of the book, he kind of, summarizes everything and says, hey, I've looked into all these things, and the one that really stuck with me was the Vipassana that was taught by U Ba Khin, in Burma. So he goes back there, takes his wife. They spend some time in meditation center. It's not quite clear if his wife is meditating or not, but he's, meditating and hanging out there, and that, kind of is the end of the book, or at least the end of the first version. He ends the book kind of saying he goes back to England, and his wife, has a child, or they have a child, and he's kind of working. He leaves the CIA, and he decides not to pursue that line of work anymore. And I think he gets a job in a factory somewhere in England. And he gets a letter from U Ba Khin who says, and it's quite detailed. It says, I want you to start teaching Vipassana, and like, you need to meditate at like this certain time of day, or I think it's the night in England. Like, I'm going to be meditating, sending out like my metta or my meditation vibrations to my teachers all over the world. So you need to be kind of meditating at that time so you can sync up with it. It's quite detailed instructions about this, but he doesn't really do anything. And that's kind of how the first version of the book ends. And then he ends up writing a postscript a number of years later. I'm not quite sure how many years later. The first version was published in 1971. And so he's still living in England, and his wife is pregnant again. And by now Goenka is teaching in India, and he's starting to teach a lot of Western hippies who are coming to his courses. And they're saying, hey, I love this Vipassana stuff. I want to continue when I go back to Europe or to America. Like, how can I do that? And, U Ba Khin had appointed various teachers, and he had apparently told Goenka about some of them. And Goenka said, well, there's this guy in England, and he's an American. His name's John Coleman. And I'm not sure exactly what kind of information he had, but he ends up getting all these hippies start showing up at his door in this like kind of like, I don't know what kind of community it is exactly. I thought it was a working class community, but I don't know how rural it is, but anyways, it's not, obviously not he's not living in a hippie community by any means. And these hippies keep showing up on his door, just saying, hey, like, you're John Coleman, like, teach me Vipassana. And, he's turning away. He says, no, I don't do that. Like, I've got a family and I've got a job. And they just keep showing up until he finally says, okay, I'll teach you a course. And the course they end up organizing ends up happening right after his wife gives birth to his second child. It was premature. So he leaves like the day after that child. And they both, him and his wife, say, like, you got to go teach this course, because if you don't teach them, these hippies are never going to stop showing up at our door. And so it just is hilarious. So, it's not really clear if he's been meditating in the intervening years at all, or very seriously, but he expresses a little bit of anxiety about teaching. And I don't think he's ever taught before. But, he goes, and apparently the course goes pretty well. And that ends up, he ends up teaching, starting a pretty long career of teaching, stretching over, I don't know how long, several decades. He teaches all over the world, in Europe and America. I think he goes to Asia and, other places, and becomes a pretty prominent teacher. And, I'm not totally sure about the details of who, if he was an official Goenka teacher, or if he was kind of an unofficial Goenka teacher, or if he was teaching just kind of these courses that were organized more kind of ad hoc. I'm not quite sure on that, but anyways, he teaches for a long, long time.
Right, boy. I mean, that description of having to meditate at a certain time, or getting, a telegram sent days or week in advance that he's to be meditating at a certain time so he can sync up with the radio vibrations being sent by Ubakin and his metta. That just gives a whole new feeling of these Zoom meditation sessions that are happening during the pandemic, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But in any case, so thanks for that great summary of going through the experience and the list of teachers that the spiritual journey that John Coleman had. So you mentioned in your essay that despite the basically uniform good reader review of this book, both on Pariyati's website as well as on Goodreads and Amazon and such, it was by far your least favorite, and not just your least favorite of the three, but I don't remember your language exactly, one of the least inspiring or interesting or poorly written books that you've read any time in the recent past, which is not an opinion I share. I'll get into my own thought in a moment, but why did you have this kind of reaction to the book?
So The Quiet Mind was the third of these three books that I read, and yeah, I was extremely disappointed in it. I'd heard about it for several years, and of course, whenever anyone mentions it, they're like, "Oh, this CIA agent in Thailand, starts meditating Vipassana, and then dedicates his life to that." And wow, that sounds amazing. That sounds like a exactly spy novel plus inspiring Dhamma story. Like, great, that sounds great. And I just found it like an entirely impersonal book. Maybe not entirely is not fair, but just to me, it was basically a set of different pamphlets on different forms of spiritual practice. He would meet someone, and then go to some area where they were practicing something, describe it in completely impersonal terms, basically like just how they would describe themselves, and then give a little bit of his impression on it, maybe mention that he practiced it, but not really give any details at all. So it was, I knew, about pretty much all the things he was talking about. I read a book by Christian Mercury. I know a little bit about Tibetan Buddhism. Of course, I know about Ubakin and all of that, and Suzuki, Zen, Quakers, all that stuff I'd, heard about before. So the information was nothing new. I was reading this book to see, wow, like, how did this guy process it in his personal story, and in the time he was living in the context he was living in. And there was really almost nothing of that. It was quite incredible. I mean, except for the last postscript, which I mentioned was published later, when he describes, how he started teaching, which I thought was an amazing story and by far the best part of the book. There was you just didn't get a sense of who this guy was. Like, who was he, and what did he feel about what he was doing? One of his first meditation experiences was in Thailand, where he went to this monastery. I think he was going to stay 2 weeks. Maybe it was just a week. But anyways, he was going to stay for this, meditation course. And he ends up staying for like 2 or 3 nights or something, and then leaves. Like it's just like really hard for him. And he doesn't give really any explanation about why he left or what happened to him. He just kind of said it was really intense, and I left. And I mean, and that's pretty crazy. Like for this great meditation teacher who goes on to have a multi-decade career in spreading Dhamma around the world, he ran away from his first course after 3 days. Like that's an amazing detail when you kind of put it out there, but with no explanation of what that meant to him or how he felt about it or why he did it. It just kind of really left me empty. And there's a million other things. Like he goes for a month-long course I think it's in southern Thailand at one point, quite a bit later. And basically it says nothing about it. I mean, it's a month-long meditation course, and he says he spends more time talking about the monkeys than he talks about how he personally felt about it. And it's really interesting. After you posted the essay online, and I guess posted on the Facebook group, one of the members of the Facebook group left this really long comment. He had, I think, meditated with Coleman or knew him or something, but just gave a ton of background on him. And it was a long comment for Facebook, is probably, I don't know, several hundred words or so, but nothing compared to the book. And in that comment, I learned more about, or maybe not more, but I definitely learned as much about John Coleman, his background and who he was and what he did in terms of the specifics than I learned in his entire book. And to me, that was just incredibly disappointing.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many directions that we could go with that. As I'm listening to you talk, I'm just taking down notes over here, the different areas that we can go to explore. So I guess the first comparison I want to make is that it actually reminds me somewhat of when I read this book called Living Buddhist Masters by Jack Cornfield. And for years, I had heard that this was this kind of groundbreaking, monumental book, that he had gone to these really remote areas all over Sri Lanka and Thailand and Burma and met these great masters and described his experiences. And just as I started going down the spiritual path, I thought, man, I can't wait to read this book. And I can't remember exactly when the book was written. I want to say like 1980 or something, but I don't know exactly. Cornfield was definitely after, or when he wrote the book was a bit after those guys. Probably sometime in the 80s it came out. In any case, when I read it in the age of internet, and also being someone who was living in Asia at the time, I just found it really kind of boring and pedestrian, I guess you can say. It almost felt to me like he had just visited every monastery one by one and had gotten a free pamphlet from that monastery, and then had written a page or two describing his personal experience, either meeting the monk or meditating or just what he learned outside of the pages. And then he put it all in a book and printed it. And here it's celebrated as this monumental books of bringing the East into Western practice. And as I reflected further on it, I became a bit more tolerant and patient with it, because I realized I'm reading this in the age of internet, where I can search some random thing online and I might not get comprehensive information, but maybe I can find something. And certainly the big traditions, I can find a lot more. And he was writing at a time when many of these great teachers were not so well known, or what was known about them was very little. And so just being able to physically go to some of these places and cool information from who these teachers were and what they were teaching, what the practice was like, put it together in a book with a bit of personalization, that's a very different book in 1980 or 1985 than it is when you're reading it in 2015 or 2020. It's just the way that information and access has changed. The interest and uniqueness of that book also changes. So one of the things I'm wondering is and Coleman, of course, wrote this book quite a bit even before that. So I wonder if that fact might affect your narrative or your review in any way.
I don't really think so. I mean, I'd have to talk to people who read it in 1972 or 1973, and at the time certainly you could make a comparison with that Cornfield book and your impression of it. But the people who are leaving stars on Pariyatti and Amazon and Goodreads are presumably read the book recently. I don't know if they're remembering their experience reading it 40 years ago. So, these are people who are reading it in the modern era and really liking it. And, to me, it's just, I don't really understand. I want to say I don't really have a problem with, him as a person. I mean, at all. He seemed like, from what little I know about him from reading his book, he seems like a fine guy, and he had a interesting life, and, really was serious about exploring his, searching for the quiet mind and all that. It just was, his ability as a writer to convey his experiences in his path in a compelling way. I just think it was a failure, basically. So
Right. So you referenced that you did notice that there were good reviews out there. And by and large, they were mostly the reviews that you're seeing on all the different aggregate sources. People, and these are reviews that people are leaving in the modern day, this year and previous years are pretty high of this book. And I also would give it a good review, and we'll get into to my pushback a little bit later. But what's your reasoning of why you're somewhat of an outlier and one of the few people that has given reviews that actually doesn't like it? Why do you think it's gotten high reviews elsewhere?
That's a question I would want to turn back to the people who give reviews, because I frankly, I can't see why anyone would really like this book and reading
Uh-huh.
it in 2020. It's as a historical artifact, it's moderately interesting. If you had personal relations with the teacher or the tradition, it provides, a few details that are kind of interesting. The plot framework, the elevator pitch for the book is great, but just the actual execution was poor. So yeah, I don't really know why people like the book. I read the reviews and I was curious about it, but these are online reviews where people are pretty brief and just kind of say, hey, I really like this and blah blah blah. And so yeah, I sorry, I don't really have any insight there.
Right. And one of the interesting things is that this is, of the three books, this is by far the most well known, owing to its free availability on Pariyati's website. The other two are pretty rare finds where I think it's fair to say that they're really not very well known in the meditator community, even though the Bhikkhu Rahula is probably more of a name in terms of a modern contemporary teacher, and he's still in robes. Another thing that makes it interesting in looking at these three books together is questioning, why were they written exactly? What was the motivation in the person putting pen to paper? Because they certainly don't give the impression of being a book that's a high release or where someone just has a great experience and wants to put it together and write it. At least in the way it's formatted. I can't remember how Eric Lerner's book was formatted, but at least the editions we found of Bhikkhu Rahula almost seems like it was a bunch of casual notes that was this kind of put down and shared with friends and family. I don't know if that was the case. And you wonder with John Coleman too, what was his motivation in writing? Was he kind of pushed to write his memoirs, or did he just kind of have some notes laying around and he put them together to just collect where he was and the teachers that he had seen? And I think that would also play into trying to analyze today what, in reviewing the quality of the books and what they were trying to do, and also looking at the author's intent, because none of the three seem really conventional in terms of what you think of like autobiographical narratives today, or at least that's my thought. I'm curious to hear what you think of it.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Of course, it's just speculating. But for Lerner, I could imagine him. He wrote it, I think, 6 years after his, or maybe it was even less. Maybe it was only like 4 or 5 years after his experience. And he became a writer, so maybe he was going down that path, and he was in contact with a publishing house, and he pitched this idea, and or maybe he had had it brewing around in his mind for a while, and stuff like that. And it's definitely the most professional of all the books, I think, in terms of the writing and kind of having a like an arc to the story and things like that. As for Bhikkhu Rahula, like yeah, his I don't know his motivation. I mean, I guess we could ask him. He's still alive and well. It kind of seems almost like a public service in some way. Like this is
Right.
the record of this monk who went from a hippie to this life, and he wrote it like I think 10 years after ordaining or something like that. So yeah, and it is more casual in a lot of ways. Like he just kind of starts from the beginning and writes and writes and writes until it ends. And he's not a great writer in terms of artistic ability, but it's really easy to read, and it keeps your attention. And it's also self-published. I mean, you can go online and from his website or wherever it is, and there's the copy you get is just this big PDF with that looks really homemade and stuff like that. But I think, yeah, for the John Coleman, it's a really interesting question why he would write that book. I mean, he wrote it, the main version, the whole book, before he started teaching. So, if he was this meditation teacher and writing his memoirs, that's one thing. But at the time, he's a father working at a factory in Britain, and kind of seems like his meditation life is done. I don't know what his personal practice was at the time, but he had kind of concluded his search for the quiet mind, and he was not going to pursue teaching under U Ba Khin at the moment. And so yeah, was he coming home from the factory every day and thinking about all the time he spent meditating and kind of missing that life, and he decided to write a memoir or something? I'm not sure. It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, and another interesting thing you explore in the essay is just looking at who these are as people. And the difference between Coleman and the other two guys is pretty obvious. I mean, the other two guys are dirty hippies with little money and lots of drugs and long hair. And John Coleman's a square, he's a former CIA agent. He's a big, bulky guy. He definitely isn't interested in the hippie movement in the book. He makes that very, very clear from various encounters and methodology. And so there's, in the hippie generation, I think it's fair to say there's more of kind of interest in meanness and exploring my feelings and my reactions. And I think very prevalent and has carried over the Western meditator movement today, and definitely in very obvious ways. But there's just more of an open exploration in both identifying and sharing one's feelings. And so it gives way to much more extensive, detailed writing and exploration on that matter in the book itself. And Coleman is coming from a more reticent background and generation and military and such. And we talked about this a bit before you wrote your review, and we were just talking personally about your thoughts on the book and mine. And this was one theory that you actually brought up and I supported, but then you shot down after you reflected on books written by contemporaries that weren't about the topic of meditation, but other so-called squares who were able in their own way to process their feelings and explore some of the inner terrain in a better way.
Yeah, and I can't think of any real specific examples right now, but, go back to Victorian England. It's extremely buttoned up, reticent society. And you have, imperial Brits going around the world, living in strange and amazing places and writing about their experiences. And, I'm sure there's varying levels of quality, but a lot of, the best of them are able to capture, the moment and their role in it and kind of their arc and things like that. And so it just seems like a sheer fact of, John Coleman's either his skill as a writer, and he's not a bad writer. I mean, again, the book's not difficult to read, or just what he wanted to reveal. There does seem to be like kind of an extreme secretiveness in the book. Maybe that's just an impression I got, but like you just wonder, like why aren't you telling more about yourself? Like that would just make the book so much better. Maybe he was writing it, so close to his time in the CIA, he just wanted to keep things close to the chest or whatever. Who knows?
Right. So before we move on and look at the three books together and talk about some of the overall lessons you learned from them, I just want to take a moment to push back on this one, just because I did like the book. I thought it was quite interesting and informative when I read. I definitely hear your opinion, and I think you have a right to them, and the things you say make sense. After you read the book, you would mention to me, like, boy, I can't wait to hear why you like it. Like, I just can't wait to get your take on why you think this is a good book, because I sure don't. My feeling when reading it is I was just fascinated in seeing this kind of firsthand experience with all these great teachers of, I can't remember exactly when it starts, 50, 60, 70, something around that range that he covers. And as you said, they're not exact with years in any of these books, but just to get this kind of who's who gallery of some of these greatest teachers across culture. And this was a time when Westerners were not so interested in the mindfulness movement and documenting it and really taking it seriously and wanting to know. And so to have a person there that was treating these teachers really fairly and really giving them a platform to stand on and taking what they said with a grain of salt and considering it honestly and often practicing under them and relaying what it was they said. I just thought it was almost like a reporter or a journalist in a sense of just being able to go and bring you firsthand to, on a plane with Krishnamurti or in a building with D.T. Suzuki or in a meditation hall with Uba Kin. And to think that like one person met all these people, that one person like Coleman who met this great teacher also met this and this and this and this great teacher. And then also some teachers that maybe weren't that great, like the Maharishi, or at least today hasn't really held up in a favorable light, but were really important then. And to get his take on what it was like to meet this person that was professing a similar thing and to kind of get a handle on what he thought of him. It reminds me of the interview I did with the Vipassana senior teacher, Daniel Mayer. And he was talking about his experiences with Maharishi and with Goenka, and then with, he never met Osho, but he was familiar with Osho. And I remember asking him a question of, well, at the time, these teachings might have seemed somewhat similar because they're all coming from Easterners professing spirituality. And he really pushed back. That was like, no, even at the moment I saw that, Goenka, Krishnamurti, like I really saw they had it together, but some of these other characters, not so much. And so to get that kind of ground reporting from someone that was interacting through this diversity in a very fair and honest way, and then assessing those encounters, to me, I just found it just incredible and just really grateful that there was a person who did this and documented it. And I think when you mention the further depth of personal exploration he could have had, I'm definitely on board with that. I definitely would not argue with the benefit that that would have brought. At the same time, it doesn't diminish in a severe way what I did enjoy about it. The more I reflect on what you said, yeah, I think that would have been really awesome for more detail to be there, but I still enjoyed what I enjoyed.
Well, yeah, I mean, to me, that's again, and the elevator pitch of the book is great, like, encountering all these people, but then when the descriptions come, they're just kind of empty. They're just, it's like you said, or like I said, they're just kind of pamphlets of describing, this is Krishnamurti, this is what he thinks, and, a couple lines about what Coleman himself thought about it, but not that much. I mean, the time and everything to think about the context, aside from the experience of reading the book, but, just thinking, pondering, who this guy was and what he was doing is incredibly fascinating. I mean, right now, especially it's pretty easy to get a handle on, what kind of direction you want to go if you're seeking the quiet mind, I guess. I mean, you're going to be quickly, if you start asking people to go online, you're going to be pretty quickly shunted towards mindfulness. And then, that's going to, there's different paths you can choose in that and different techniques. But, he was going everything from ESP to the Quakers to, erotic tantrism to, Ubakin Vipassana, and, approaching each one kind of, like you said, like giving each one its due. And just kind of saying okay, some people say you're the answer, show me what you got, and just kind of giving them an opportunity, which is kind of an amazing thing to think about, in this day and age, like someone who is, in their 20s kind of feeling they wanted some more peace of mind, like they probably wouldn't, think, okay, I'll try mindfulness for a little bit, and then, maybe I'll go hang out with the Mormons for a while, and, then I'll try, some cult down in, some maybe go hang out. I don't know, just try all kinds of really disparate things. There's just so much more information out there. But, back then he just would hear, hey, there's these tantric people up in northern India. And, he's like, well, get on a plane and go check them out. And that's kind of a cool attitude that I don't think, exists now.
Right. So just one last thing to wrap up before we move on from the book. And that's, you had mentioned briefly before the appointment that Coleman received from U Ba Khin. And I think that's just interesting to think about for a moment, because today with the mindfulness and meditation movement, so much more codified and structures and administrations so much more set in place, the teacher appointment, the teacher training, the teacher verification, all of that are much more formal things. And if you go back 100, 150 years, as I've researched in some of the books, some of the presentations that I've prepared for with earlier monks, Lady Sayadaw, Sayataji, much earlier back, this kind of meditation structure isn't in place. It's developed over the years. U Ba Khin is kind of an interesting middle teacher in there where it was starting to become more formalized, but it wasn't quite where it is today. So what was the sense of the officialdom or the formality on one side versus more kind of just being casual and not being so specific of the nature of the appointment that U Ba Khin gave to Coleman? What was your feeling as you were reading that part of it?
Well, it sure seemed like U Ba Khin wanted to make it, an official thing. He gave, very specific instructions about these kind of meditation sync-ups and things like that. But, based on the book, I don't think U Ba Khin and Coleman spent, more than 30 days together or something. I know he went to IMC twice, one for, I don't know how long, but he was basically there twice, and each trip was not super long. So, and probably a lot of the time he would spend meditating or doing something else. So, his actual time interacting with U Ba Khin was probably extremely brief. And it's just fascinating to think that, based on that, U Ba Khin decided that, this guy was going to be one of his teachers. And, why was that? Was that, something U Ba Khin sensed in him in their brief meeting? Like, this guy gets it and he's at a level where he can do this. Was it more practical? Like, I need a guy in England or, in Western Europe. And I remember this guy and he seemed really serious. That's impossible to say. But the word whimsy is maybe a little bit critical, but it just seemed much more haphazard. I mean, U Ba Khin sends this, and then I'm not sure how many years later, but then just by sheer chance, Goenka remembers his name and starts sending people there, and people have time and energy to search him out. And, who knows if Coleman was even meditating at the time. He was certainly had never taught before. And, he was pretty deep into his life in England. And all of a sudden he's being asked to be a meditation teacher. And he just kind of says yes, just to get these people off his back. And that turns into a whole career. And, I mean, sure, today there's probably, charlatans out there who just present themselves as mindfulness teachers after, taking a little seminar or something. And maybe charlatans is a little bit too harsh, but, back then it was like really was hardly any people available. So, he had definitely some bona fides in terms of experience and practice. And, it was a good thing that Goenka was able to remember his name and that people would be able to find him. And, a good solid career of meditation teaching was to come out of that. I mean, one thing I thought about is that if it was today and, you go to Burma and you meditate and you have a deep experience and then you go back home to somewhere in the West and your teacher emails you and says, hey, I think you should start teaching. Well, you can kind of just do that. Like you can just put out something on Facebook or put up a flyer in the library and, people have kind of the base level of interest and awareness of mindfulness and meditation that, you'll probably get some people to come to your whatever you're doing. And you can go from there. Whereas, back then in, whatever, town he was working out in England, if he would have gone to the local pub and, asked people if they were interested in learning meditation, they would have, either laughed him out or threw him out.
Yeah, right. So moving to the last part of our talk where we look at these three books together and look at you as the fourth character in there. Your last piece in the essay really brought together these books and talked not only about how they related to one another, but also common threads running through them, and also what they told us about the eras they took place in, the time periods, and where the mindfulness movement has moved since. So spend some time exploring that a little bit here at the end. So first off, you explore this notion of karma on one hand versus, we can call it, accessibility. And it might sound a little bit awkward or funny to put it that way, but these incredible chance encounters that were necessary for these guys to find Dhamma, and how it's now pretty much around every corner these days. So not only did that make you personally long for a kind of nostalgia of what it felt like to find yourself in the right place at the right time and get it just by this kind of confluence of events coming together, this is something that Internet 2.0 has definitely taken away from all parts of our life, whether it's, finding a restaurant or travel or a friend or a partner or whatever, or a meditation teacher. You also wonder aloud if it's better to have Dhamma found in more traditional forms in faraway Buddhist countries, with it being open to only a very small number of people who are able to go there and access it, like these three pretty extraordinary people, or if it's better for it to be more widely shared with the masses, but in a much more diluted state, or has been combined more with the local culture and needs. And so this is a juxtaposition and a question that you ask. And one thing in the essay you didn't do was answer that question. So what would be your answer of these two ways of accessing the Dhamma, or the Dhamma being available? Is there one that you think is better, or that you prefer, or that you think is a more effective way forward?
Yeah, I think personally for me, there's no doubt like how we have it now is much better in the overall judgment. Like if you're making an overall judgment, I'd definitely prefer having things now. Of course, there's advantages and disadvantages on both sides, but back in the day, like back when these three guys were trying, like the efforts that they had to go through, both the effort and then the kind of luck or karma or whatever, just unusual circumstances for their introductions to Dhamma to happen are just kind of astounding, and they're definitely more glamorous. I mean, when Bhikkhu Rahula first hears about Goenka, he's stoned. I think on LSD, maybe it's just pot, but he's stoned out of his gourd, of course, like sitting by a river, I think in maybe this hot spring by a river in Nepal. And this guy comes up and they start chatting, and the guy, says, hey, there's this Goenka guy and he's pretty cool and he teaches courses. And it's just like, wow, what a scene. He's been traveling for several months and had all these adventures, and he's up in Nepal and, lounging by the river, and this, stoned out of his gourd, and has this chance conversation with this guy who, a few months later, he ends up taking a course with Goenka. And I mean, that's a great story. It's a much better story than someone saying like, yeah, my buddy at work told me about mindfulness, so I downloaded this app, and yeah, it's pretty nice. I get a lot out of it. But I think it's much better to have the doors wide open to people. People still have the opportunity to go really deep, like there's retreat courses to go to. There's becoming a monk is obviously much more difficult in the West, but it is possible. People, the other people you've interviewed on your podcast have done that in different forms, becoming a teacher or a long-term volunteer for meditation organizations. And you just don't have to be special to encounter meditation or the Buddhist teachings. And I think that's that's how it worked when the Buddha was around. I mean, he wasn't, hiding on top of a mountaintop where the person who was seeking the truth had to scale up there and encounter him. He was, down in the towns and staying in the parks and preaching to, housewives and merchants and soldiers and things like that. And I think we're closer to that than we were. Well, I know we're closer to that kind of situation now than we were 30, 40 years ago. And so to me, it's a much better situation now on the whole.
That's really funny. As I was listening to you talk, I don't know if you remember this, but our first experience of meditation, our first touch, both you and I, was also being stoned in a hot springs in Nepal. There was a moment we were trekking in Nepal, and we went to sit in the hot springs, and I think there are these, it might have been Israeli backpackers, or there was someone who sat down with us, and they'd been doing some kind of meditation. I don't remember what it was, but we were all really interested. And he just kind of gave us a 5-minute instruction to stare at the clouds and to be aware of our thoughts as we were looking at the clouds. And that was literally my first moment of meditation. I don't know if you remember that incident.
Well, I remember being in the Riverside hot springs, but man, I don't remember the meditation, which is pretty interesting. I don't believe we were on intoxicants at the time, but we might have been hungover from them.
Right. So anyway, just another kind of curious commonality, but going on a more serious note, going back to the points that you bring up with where mindfulness is spread, it reminds me, I read this book last month called Mindful America, and one of the questions that it poses in the mindfulness movement going forward and where it's spreading is he presents all the ways that mindfulness has been adapted to the American scene. And then the last chapter kind of asks this open-ended question that he doesn't answer because there kind of is no answer, no objective answer at least, that is it a triumph of mindfulness over materialism that it's found everywhere? So mindfulness has really triumphed because it's been able to integrate all around and it's more accessible. Or on the other hand, is it a triumph of materialism over mindfulness because it's been totally integrated in our political and economic cultures rather than confronting and overturning them? So that's also another interesting thing to think about as the Vipassana meditation mindfulness movements have continued to spread.
Yeah, that is a fascinating question. I mean, I think you can say either one in different contexts for sure. Like there's definitely mindfulness in the form that has materialism has kind of become the bigger priority when, you see it used for productivity and things like that. And even for more mundane but more serious things like calming anxiety and things like that. I mean, those are kind of considered secondary objectives when in kind of more serious Buddhist practice. But I think there's definitely more openness and more availability for having mindfulness be the triumph over materialism. Definitely compared to the 60s and 70s, and of course compared to before then.
Right. And so given these three eras, like let's say there's the early days of, we can call it like the 50s to the 70s, and then there's the more established periods that you and I are a part of say the 80s through the aughts through the 2000s, and then there's the current time period of like the 2010s on. Of these three periods, where would you want to place yourself as a Dhamma practitioner? And is there one of these periods you would call like a golden age?
That's a great question. I mean, it's funny, when we first started meditating, I think I took my first course in 2002. And in the 5 or 6 years after that, I was, probably my most serious time in terms of, sitting meditation practice. I remember, still being just completely thrilled when I would see meditation or specifically Vipassana mentioned in the news or in pop culture. It just seemed like the most astounding thing in the world. And, now you can probably find 10 news reports today, or this week talking about that kind of stuff. So it's just become so common and so common that, it's no longer thrilling. It's almost, disheartening in some ways to see it so integrated. The McMindfulness phrase, of course, kind of sums that up perfectly. I don't really know. It's so hard to say because, access to the teachings is such an important factor. And if you say, like, when I was reading the books, especially the first two books, there was a real sense of kind of like having missed out on a great time. Like this hippie trail really sounded cool, and all these like, new experiences that were just like only available to a select group of people were, and the settings were so kind of untouched and pure. Like, wow, that sounds really great, for sure. But like, when you contrast it with the fact that, these people's friends and families back in America, are completely cut off from those experiences is kind of a tragedy. And now, like, that's not the case. Like, we all have experiences with people in our lives who have tried mindfulness now where you're like, wow, this person tried it. Like, that's amazing. And then you've got something out of it. And so it's really hard for me to say that like a past era was a golden age when accessibility was so restricted. And accessibility is, such a key element of this because, really it's supposed to be helping people. And if it's, only helping a small select group who are, part of a counterculture that is open to it, that's, kind of too bad. That really kind of is a ding on its status as a golden age.
Right, right. And that being said, it's worth recalling that Buddhism was not native to Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, and all those places it arrived and it settled there. That happened a long time ago. And so the experiment that we see happening now in the West, it's only been quite a bit more long going there back in the Buddhist countries today than it is here. And another thing is, nor is it static. When you look at those Buddhist countries in Southeast Asia, society's relationship with the understanding of the Dhamma goes through profound transformations there from one historical period to another. And we're not talking centuries, we're talking decades. So would it be fair to say that this moment right now in the US, we're only just now finding our footing and finding the right fit? It's not going to be a perfect process as we go there. And I think it's really easy to look at what we're doing wrong and what's being watered down, what's being diluted, what's kind of being silly. If we take a wider view of history and we look at what has happened with the spread of religion and spirituality anywhere in human history, this is what happens as things get transplanted. So would there be an argument for taking a longer view of history and being a bit more patient and tolerant of some of the jumps and starts that we're seeing here?
Oh, for sure. I think so. I mean, the U.S. is, I don't even think out of or the West in general is out of the, childhood stage of Dhamma. There's some centers that are decades old now and, are pretty established. But, I really think it remains to be seen if, in another few decades or 50 years or so, if we're going to have, it seems like mindfulness is going to stick around. Like maybe it'll, in the greater culture, it'll prove to be a fad, like, aerobics or something like that. But, it seems like it's being adopted pretty seriously by, kind of all levels of society. But I think it really remains to be seen if it's going to be adopted in a way where kind of the more serious, more Buddhist approach is going to be kind of the foundation of it, or if the kind of like plug and play mindfulness where you can just, you can be corporate mindfulness. It can be, taught in a sports gym, like after a yoga class. If, it can be taught in schools to help kids behave better. If that kind of like, and superficial might be harsh, but it is kind of superficial compared to I think a more Buddhist practice. But, that might be kind of like what mindfulness is in the West. And there's only a few scattered people who are really kind of dedicated to the more Buddhist practice. And I think it's really up in the air as to what we're going to end up with.
Mm-hmm. And you note that elsewhere in the essay that these books read kind of like a bygone era of travel and discovery in an age where now McMindfulness is really around every corner. So why would you think it might be interesting, relevant, even important for younger practitioners today who don't really know this background or past, just kind of know what comes to them through the mindfulness app or whatnot? Why might it be important for them to learn about where it came from and some of these early days?
Well, it's funny because like, these books, especially the first two that we talked about, are really about, the early days of Dhamma, like when you find it in the first, year or so, or the first year or so after you get serious about it, where you're just really dedicated to it, just really inspired by it, kind of kind of overdoing a lot of things and just hasty or just frantic about your practice. And, that's most evident in Lerner's book, I think. But still, like, Bhikkhu Rahula was really intense, like right away. And he was, just definitely going full bore. And I'm not sure what he ended up doing in his life, but it seems kind of hard to imagine that he was that intense. He's been that intense for the last 30, 40 years. And, in some ways I'm critical of that time. Like that, that's a time that I've grown out of, and I'm glad I've grown out of it. Like, even though I miss certain parts of it, it's, I realized that was a stage of immaturity in terms of me as a Dhamma practitioner, as a meditator. And so it's, in some ways I'm critical of that time, but I also found it extremely valuable. Like it's extremely, like the experiences you have then are so profound, and they're so moving, and they're so transformational that, I'm just so grateful I went through that period. I don't know what would have happened if I would just have dipped my toes in, doing like 20 minutes a day, for 6 months or so. Like, what would my life have been like that then? Would I, maybe that you can do it that way and not have this kind of frantic stage where you just burn so bright, expending all this kind of energy in an inefficient way. Like, maybe that's the way, I'm not sure. But to me, like, these profound experiences and retreats are just a really valuable part of the experience. And, for people now who, maybe tried meditation through an app or a short-term course, in their daily life, like, to go to retreats and have these experiences, or to read books about, the possibilities that are out there, I would think that would be something that would be really inspirational and hopefully encourage them to explore deeper practice.
Yeah, and I think also just knowing the flow of history of a field that you're interested in, I just think it brings a profound shift in perspective of what it is that you're doing. Just knowing that you're part of a flow that has come before you and made you what you are, help shape your understanding and the possibilities, and it continues to carry on. I think that's true whether you're a meditator, looking at where this mindfulness movement came from, in addition to actually doing your practice. I was listening to a podcast the other day. It was about NBA basketball, and they were just talking about the difference of the young players today who know the history of the game and know the greats, and the ones that are just completely caught up in the modern era without an appreciation of what came before them and how the game developed. So I think that being someone who loves history and feels in some way shaped by history, in the sense that the more I learn about a place or a concept or a development, it changes where I place myself on that trajectory, that I didn't come out of nowhere, and that the opportunities available to me also didn't come out of nowhere, but kind of seeing how they were shaped and brought to me in present day.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Yeah, so shifting to another topic, diversity. This is perhaps no more pressing than today, where in the wake of these recent Black Lives Matters protests and the movement, all kinds of social institutions are being questioned as never before. So while opportunities for non-white American males were definitely less back then to engage with the Dhamma, to travel in general, there was, as you mentioned, there was one book that could have been read. This was Mary Byles' Journey into Burmese Silence. That was definitely a book in line with these, of a Westerner, an Australian woman in this case, who visited mainly Burma and talked about her experiences with two different disciples of Lady Sayadaw. But in any sense, my question to you is, while this lack of diversity wasn't explored by the authors in this book, it was noticed by you. And what's interesting is that this lack of awareness in terms of a lack of diversity would ultimately feed into establishing an organizational structure that very likely also didn't take into account this diverse audience who could benefit from these teachings. And that's starting to be questioned today and still persists. And so while reading, was there any moment or anything you caught where this blindness to diversity allowed you to notice or to observe some unexamined assumptions on the part of the authors?
I think in the first two books, Lerner's and Bhikkhu Rahula's, not as much. It's funny, being in the hippie generation, we kind of now, or at least I do, associate that with the civil rights fight for racial equality, as well as, the feminist movement of that time. And, maybe that's wrong for me for really associating them so closely together. But, those guys didn't really show any awareness of, the kind of what we would call identity politics now. They just, they were who they were, and they went through life. And, for the most part, they treated people pretty well, that so far as I could tell. Like, I don't recall any really sexist remarks or racist remarks or even really, quote unquote problematic remarks, anything like that. It was just kind of like it wasn't even on their radar. It wasn't, they didn't even think about the fact that most people meditating were white males, heterosexuals, all that, all that. So not so much with them. John Coleman, for sure. I mean, he's definitely, evidently a man of before the hippie generation and of the 50s. He makes quite a number of statements in the book about the differences between Asian culture and Western culture that are at best extremely old-fashioned. He's not really critical of Asian culture. If anything, he's praising it in terms of these differences. So you couldn't really call it, racist in kind of a vindictive sense, but it's, it's the kind of stereotypes that people just do not really throw around these days, things about, Asians being more inscrutable and contemplative and, non-dualistic and things like that are just kind of seem ridiculous now. He definitely makes some statements about women that are a bit more retrograde, but again, nothing extremely ugly, but just, kind of more the women are, made for making babies and being in the home, and that's kind of the natural order of things, and that's obviously not something that a writer would write today. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting, kind of unsurprising to see that in Coleman's book, just given who he was and the age he was coming from. I kind of expected I'd see a little more in the opposite direction, like a little more awareness of race or gender or things like that in the other two books. But, maybe that was just my preconceived notions about what the hippies were.
Right. And I just think that's interesting when you think today with some of the questioning of social institutions that's happening and some of the unexamined assumptions from the largely white Western male base that brought these teachings to us and might have inadvertently continued a sense of white privilege or unexamined assumptions with the way they were setting things up. And I think that was good on you to identify that. And I think that's a discussion that really needs a lot more focus and examination today of how we really can make these teachings accessible across a wide spectrum of different, not just different races and backgrounds, but also different socioeconomic skills and such. So as we talked about at the outset of the talk, you brought yourself into the essay as a fourth character, and you spent some time reminiscing on your own discovery of meditation in your youth, the fervor, the enthusiasm that you brought to practice during this time because it was mirroring some of what you read in the pages. What did it feel like to recall those years, to go back and remember the feeling and what it was like when you were caught up in that? I'm not sure if that's something that's been on your mind lately. And as you were reading these books and doing the review and writing, that living back in those years was very much something you were doing for several weeks. And so what was that like to be back there?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I haven't thought about those years, so deeply in quite a while. And if you read the essay, you'll see there's, I describe a period of enthusiasm and then kind of a period of maybe, disillusionment or, spiritual crisis, and then kind of now feeling like I've come out the other side of that. And I spent a lot of time kind of processing those years of disillusionment and spiritual crisis and kind of figuring out like what exactly that meant and why it happened and things like that. But I haven't, really examined the years of just kind of pure enthusiasm and dedication. And yeah, I'll be honest, it made me feel nostalgic, kind of wistful for those years. Just I remember during that time, just kind of feeling like no matter what kind of time off I had, I wanted to spend that, in serious meditation. Like if I could get 5 days and there was a center nearby, I wanted to go there for 5 days. If I could get 2 weeks, I wanted to go for a 10-day course and then stay on and serve a little bit. This was in the Goenka tradition. And, that's not how I live now for sure. I mean, if anything, I've lost that dedication. I feel like I wish I had some of it back. Like I definitely would like to get away for a course, and, it's not lack of time that's preventing me. It's lack of motivation. So, there was definitely some kind of, wistfulness, tinged with a little bit of regret, things like that, mixed at the same time with, I felt it especially in Lerner's book, because his book is, like I said, so frantic and kind of unbalanced in so many ways. I just kind of felt like an old man kind of laughing at a young child, just be like, oh yeah, I went through that too, and that was tough. I'm sure glad I'm not, in that space anymore. So it's kind of this mixture of wishing there was some of that energy and passion still there, but at the same time, definitely not missing I don't know what you call it, the ignorance, I guess, of that time.
Yeah. And in going down that road, you kind of push back at this happily ever after idea of an ending and wondering what happens next to the authors. And as mentioned earlier, it's quite interesting because that's not really embedded in the text. That's really a reading that you brought to it based on who you were when you read it. And as you yourself say, when you look back on your meditative practice, you weren't on like a straight German Autobahn as you had once thought. So I know that you did some online research of these characters and trying to find out what happened to them physically after the book ended, but there's no way to really learn about how their actual practice grew and changed, the challenges, the crises of faith that they may have undergone. And not knowing this, you use it as a jumping off point to reflect about your own spiritual journey. And what you go on to write is so detailed and thorough, I think it's best to bring to the listeners who didn't read the essay. So after you had your this is it moment, and the moment where you were just describing, where if you had 5 days, you wanted to go to a center and meditate 5 days. You have 2 weeks, you want to sit a 10-day course and then spend a few days serving. After this kind of this is it moment of finding the Dhamma passed, what happened next? What state were you in?
Well, it continued for a while, and I like I said, it just felt like I was on the straight and narrow path. Like I made a lot of changes in my life and felt a lot of improvements from, the retreats and the daily practice. And, I met some teachers that I really looked up to. Just the kind of the vibe they gave off, I thought was something I'd been looking for, and kind of something that, yes, I want, this is the kind of vibe I want to have, in 10, 15, 20 years. And the instructions were so clear in the Goenka tradition that, this is the practice, and it's not, terribly difficult to learn. You can learn it in a few days, and, just implementing it and continuing it is the challenge. But it just kind of felt like, okay, I have the recipe, and I'll just, put it into practice, and time will pass, and I'll do whatever I can to dedicate more and more time to that. And eventually I'll just keep feeling better and better. And that just, kind of stopped. Like I wasn't that, I continued to go to retreats, and they continued to be fairly profound, and I continued daily practice, and that, kind of in the moment felt nice to come home from work and, meditate and be that. But there was just a really loss of momentum, of, change and things like that. And, plateauing or stagnating, all those terms definitely apply. And I felt just so confused by it for so long. And it took me a long, long time to even admit that I was just having problems. And, I tried talking to different people, teachers and friends and things like that. And, no one really within the tradition had an answer for me, or at least, something that really clicked. And yeah, I eventually just kind of stopped meditating, not fully at first. The 2-hour a day practice is kind of the standard in the Goenka tradition. And if you're kind of doing that, you're kind of, on the train, you're a member in good standing. And, letting go of that was a huge step. And eventually I did, actually, right after I sat my first long course. And that was kind of a really surprising moment, because I'd gone through such profound change with meditation in the early days. It was really coming from a point of suffering in a lot of ways, that meditation just changed almost overnight. And it was just such a miracle that I was just, bowled over by it. And it generated so much faith and so much dedication. And I was just kind of terrified. I don't know if it was the messaging of the tradition or if it was my own thinking, but I was terrified that if I stopped that meditation, I would just kind of revert back to this, who I was in the past. And, eventually I was just so frustrated and so disillusioned that I, stopped meditating 2 hours a day, and it went down to about an hour, and, kept getting less and less. And, nothing really changed, or at least nothing substantial. I certainly didn't go back to who I was at 24 years old. And, that was kind of a shock to me. And it really has made me question, what Dhamma practice is and how it affects us, how it affects your mind, how it affects your behavior. And, for the longest time, I thought it was just like weightlifting or exercise, where if you stop doing it, you're just going to get fat or get soft. And, when that didn't really happen, when my mind didn't go back to kind of its old harmful habit patterns, I really had to rethink it. And so that was kind of part of the process.
Right. And you mentioned that the main advice you received from Dhamma friends and teachers at the time when you were going through this could basically be boiled down to something like, don't be lazy, just keep sitting, power through this. It's eventually going to pass away. And I'm sure there's listeners that are hearing this now and are meditators and are thinking the same thing, that like, hey, man, with more steadfast determination, whatever defilement that's there, that's keeping you off the cushion, that's keeping you from continuing to make this a priority in your life, that this is a defilement that eventually is going to be let go of with just more prolonged work and focus and meditation. And yet you deal with this piece of advice head on in your essay and writing and how you dealt with it. And how was that? You definitely heard this advice from a lot of people, directly, indirectly, from the teachings and the instructions themselves. How did this particular piece of advice fit into what you were going through, and how did it work or not work?
Yeah, well, at first it was the advice I was telling myself. I was just like, well, this will pass, and I just need to rededicate myself or work harder or things like that. And but after a while, you just kind of wonder. In the Goenka tradition, they talk about storms that come, and storms that are these kind of periods of extreme difficulty in your practice. And so I was constantly wondering, is this just a storm that is maybe not so much a storm, but like a weather system that has just floated over me and is going to be here for years. And if I don't keep working at it, it's just going to stay forever. And so therefore, that advice of just like keeping working is what it was. And, I think what I eventually figured out is that, those things pass, everything passes. I mean, that's kind of the basic teaching, like everything passes. And that feeling was going to pass kind of no matter what I did. Like if I worked really hard, like eventually it was going to pass in some way. And if I stopped working, it was going to pass, probably in a different way. And so that was kind of a funny thing to realize, because it's kind of different from the Sankara model of you have this solid defilement that is just not going anywhere unless you shine the light of Vipassana on it really firmly. And I think there's definitely something to that model. Like, there's great value in like sitting down and examining your mind for long periods and things like that. But also, the mind just changes kind of, in some ways it's not, well, in a lot of ways it's not under our control. And I think that like the advice thinking that it wasn't going to change unless I worked at it was, kind of flawed in a way, because it was going to change no matter what. And eventually I stopped meditating, and I stopped and eventually I just let go of that feeling, that feeling like I needed to have this kind of progress and things like that. And that I think was really more what made the cloud lift, is just the letting go. And, I understand that is kind of part of the teachings of any kind of Buddhist tradition, but I do think that sometimes that those kind of core approaches of just letting go and just like, not being attached gets kind of subsumed by specific techniques. And it's, this is not limited to the Goenka tradition at all. Like, you think that you have this tool that you need to apply to this problem over and over. And, the tool is supposed to be useful, but it's not really the tool itself that you're using. It's the underlying principles that cause that tool to work in these certain circumstances. And I think in some ways I lost sight of the circumstances and was concentrating on the tool.
Right. That makes sense. And another thing I'm thinking as I hear you talk is recalling back how you described it in your essay. And you use this really interesting analogy of a food, or maybe not an analogy, but you use the idea of food in two different ways to represent the confusion, the inner turmoil you were going through. That on one, and it's definitely something I relate to, and not just me, but having lived in Myanmar as long as I've had, and having a lot of monastic friends that have gone in and out of the monastic order of monks or nuns and have dealt with all kinds of crazy and confusing and complicated cultural matters when they've been going through it. And this is a dynamic I see coming up again and again. And it's this idea of, do I this storm, actually even to use the word storm is kind of a subjective thing. This issue that I'm going through, this thing that's confusing me. Is this something that I really need to deny all food to? Food meaning like mental thought and consternation and emotional residue, or, whatever that is. I really need to deny food to what this matter is, because that's distracting me. That's making me boil in this and giving more wood for the fire and just keep going and going and going. I need to cut off this food and just observe and kind of burn what's left, and then I can move on from it. It's one choice you have of looking at how you proceed and how you progress. The opposite of that, which is, completely the flip side, completely 180, is this idea that I actually need more food. I need to consider this critically. I need to be open to other ways of looking at this and really use the old noggin, really think deeply and critically about what is it that's going on to me, and is this right, and what's the best way to work with it? And so it becomes this dynamic of using the food analogy of like, is this something that I deny food and just let the practice take care of itself, because food will just distract me and make things more confusing? Or is this something that actually needs more food? And by not giving it more food of consideration and critical thought, I'm getting more insulated. I'm getting more confused about what's happening. I'm getting more out of touch with reality. And it's really confusing when you're in those spiritual moments to figure out what is the best way of working. And that kind of relates to what you said of knowing what is the best tool for a given time.
Yeah, for sure. And both of the approaches you describe are valid, in different circumstances. I mean, if for certain things, like if you're trying to give up a really bad habit, like, maybe intoxicants or something like that, like, probably the best way is just to stop doing it and try not to think about it or avoid it, and eventually a couple of years pass and you'll be like, wow, I haven't really thought about, having a beer or smoking a bowl in a long time now. And okay, I'm kind of over that, and great. And whereas if you were just trying to kept analyzing it and analyzing, maybe, you would have just kind of spun your wheels. But I'm kind of thinking now that, like, in the first few years approaching Dhamma, you kind of, or at least and it seems like a lot of people who are like kind of given a technique that they really like, kind of take the simplistic approach that you don't give food to stuff. And it's just like saying like, okay, here I have this tool that's really useful, and all I need to do is use this tool in the way that is told to me, and just, keep doing that until I finish. And, that definitely it has a certain effect, extremely profound effects a lot of times, but, that's not the only way to work. And it's kind of embarrassing to think back on myself now, that I thought things were so simple, like, the mind and its relationship to, how its habits and attachment and all those things is incredibly complex and tricky. And just to think that I could be given, one really simple set of instructions that was just going to kind of take me all the way there is, really kind of laughable right now. It's like, and I don't really blame the teachers so much for that as kind of just this enthusiasm of like, oh my gosh, I found this simple technique and it's right away, it's proven to be so useful. Like, all I need to do is just kind of stay on this escalator and I'll get to the final goal. Whereas, really, the mind there's a lot more going on there, and you have to take a much more kind of proactive approach to it, really thinking about what you're going to do and why you're going to do and all that. And, I think that, right now I can't say that I'm really implementing that in my daily life, maybe a little bit more than I used to. But, if I was going to go back into deeper Dhamma practice, I hope that I'd have that approach, more than just of, okay, like here's 10 days, it's 100 hours of on the cushion. Like, I'm just going to kind of put in the hours basically.
Yeah. And it's really interesting thinking about that, because I recall back after my second Vipassana course in Japan, and I left the course with so many questions of, like, I was really on the cusp of becoming a serious student and dedicating my life to it. And I wanted to know, well, why is it working this way? And what happens if I feel like this? And, I read this in the book and it doesn't really correspond with this. And I remember the teacher who was there at the time, the course had ended and there was another resident teacher that came and stayed at the center. And so it wasn't my course teacher, but kind of like a center teacher. And Canadian guy, really, really nice, gentle guy. And I was asking him for this advice, and he just kind of gave me this gentle, calm smile and said, just go on the cushion. Like, the practice you're going to do, it's going to give you better answers than I ever could. Better answers you could read in a book or you can get by talking to anyone else. Just work it out on the cushion and find your resolution there. And when you talk about these tools, that was a tool that I'd never had in my life. And I think it's interesting to go back to this moment because you're talking about tools as kind of like they get worn out, or like someone gives you a hammer and then you go around the world and the only thing you're doing is using a hammer to fix every problem. And actually there's more tools out there. And so you're kind of looking at the disadvantages of relying too much on a tool. But when you go back to the very beginning, it was like, this was a tool that I never knew was possible. And I had done 2 courses. So like I knew what the practice was and I knew the process. I just didn't realize it was a tool that could be used for when I got stuck and trying to figure something out. It was like, hey, I'm stuck. And like, the way I know how to figure out is I'm going to think about it. I'm going to write about it. I'm going to read about it. I'm going to talk about it. And this guy was like, no, go sit on the cushion. And that's where you'll get some insight and some learning. And it was so profound to me, that response is so profound that like, wow, I really can do that. And that stayed with me for years and years and years, just that power of sit on the cushion and work it out there. But then eventually it did get to a point where it was like, I don't know if it was a way of escapism or a way of not being critical or creative or playful, but that what at that moment was such a new way of dealing with an old situation that really provided answers, and then realizing that itself needed to kind of transform as it went into different areas. And I think that gets to the question I have for you in what you write in the essay, is that although you do feel some regret and nostalgia for this time when you had a stronger practice, you also see yourself as passing through a stage of a Dhamma child to a Dhamma adolescent. So can you share more what you mean by this, what these terms mean, and how they've reflected your own journey?
Yeah, well, the Dhamma child and Dhamma adolescence, it's actually a phrase of your co-host, Zach, and I think I've even heard him use that on the podcast before. So, but basically what he means by that is Dhamma adolescence is just a time where you're exerting more authority and independence over your practice. And therefore, and also, having more responsibility, when you, as a Dhamma child, you felt really sheltered under the hand of the teacher, and there was so much to learn in these early areas. You could kind of give up your own, I don't know, initiative or maybe even decision-making power in a lot of ways to just the teaching in itself, and just kind of grow in that. And there's a lot of opportunity for that. But, I think eventually you kind of have to be out more on your own. And by on your own, I don't necessarily mean leaving a tradition or just kind of going out into the world by yourself necessarily. It's just more of a, taking more responsibility for your practice and how it develops and how it goes. And, that's a scarier stage. It's really comforting to just have simple instructions, or maybe not simple, but just clear instructions of what you need to do to progress. And, there's a lot of comfort in that. I remember, thinking as an early meditator, like, wow, so simple, like everyone can do this and then they'll be happy. And then that doesn't even really work out for myself, in the end. And I think for a lot of people, it's not that simple. And so that now, like, I'm in a stage where, I've got to make a lot of more choices. And some of those choices are going to be, it's just more reliant on what I do and my own initiative and my own thinking. And, it might not be great choices for sure. I might make mistakes. I might, try things that don't work, or I might, allow myself to be, I don't know, lazier or just not as earnest and try that out for a while and see how that feels and all things like that. But, going back to like this idea of Dhamma as an exercise, or as I compare it to walking through a door in a lot of ways. I think the exercise analogy works in some areas, but, once you kind of understand the tenets, and once you kind of integrate those tenets into you, to a certain extent, they're not going to leave you. They're not going to, it's not like I'm going to go back and think like, oh, if only I made a bunch of money, I'd be happier. That ship has sailed for now. And so, I have all this wisdom that, I've been given, through the hard work of the teachers that came before me. And I'm really grateful for that. And now it's more becoming my turn to kind of figure out how to apply those tools or the tools that I've been given, or talking to people or exploring, finding other tools to, use the principles that I have to apply to my practice and to my life.
Yeah, that's really great. It's great to hear all that. And I know I've said this several times before, but I have to restate it. I just find it so interesting, the interpretation that you gave to the books based on where you're at, because these ideas of like the different stages you pass through as a meditator, or the different eras in time, 70s or 2010s that you find Dhamma, like these are not ideas embedded in the books. They're ideas you brought to it and then worked out in the essay. And that's what makes it so interesting to look at. And it's also, on the other hand, just the inverse of that. It would be really interesting to think of, if you would come across these books 3 years after your first course, how gung-ho and fired up you would have been about people that were speaking the same thing you were and talking the same language and into the same thing. And it just reminds you of how important it is who you are when you read the book that you do and what you get out of it.
Right. Yeah. And also kind of extending on that, I kind of lament the fact that, there aren't books about these kind of later stages in meditation that are, a bit more complicated and a bit more, not so clear cut. And, if anyone out there knows of any books like that, I sure would like to read something.
Yeah. And you did mention in your essay that you mentioned that these books are not necessarily great books in the sense of like great literature. And you compared that to The Snow Leopard, which you thought was a great book and really did impact you, who you were and what you lived through at that time. And I'm curious, in reading The Snow Leopard, this is a book that's by Peter Mathiasson, I think is how you say his name. It's not a book about meditation, but it is a book about a young Westerner around the same time who goes to roughly the same area in Nepal and gets kind of Eastern wisdom to help him with his suffering. And this was a book that, as you read in your mid-20s, really did have a profound effect on you at that time and place in your life. And so when you think back of this being great literature and how you were affected at that time and place in your life, what do you recall of that book and of your feeling reading it?
Well, it's been 20 years or roughly since I read it, so I'm afraid I don't recall a whole lot about it. But, it's interesting talking about the different aspects of books and why they're good and why we like them. But, I definitely do remember being moved by The Snow Leopard in terms of just the language he uses and some of the things he relates. I remember really clearly him talking about his experience with psychedelics and just how he became disillusioned with them. And it was just an incredibly beautiful passage or section of the book, just him describing the experiences and why he felt like he was over them. And it was just really crystallized, like why he was right, like why, psychedelics were profound and maybe even valuable. But in the end, there was kind of a limit to how far you could go with them. And, that's not something really that you get from Bhikkhu Rahula's book, who, maybe a little bit he talks about that, but he doesn't really explore it in detail. But at the same time, like you said, the Snow Leopard is not a Theravada book. It's not I can't even remember if it's really explicitly a Buddhist book. So in that sense, there's, kind of a sense of distance between, him and his experiences and my experiences where, these three guys, are all meditating in the Theravada tradition for the most part. They've been to a lot of places that I've been in Asia, in Burma and in India. And they talk about teachers that, if I didn't meet them, but I know of them. And so there's a real feeling of closeness to these guys, even if their books aren't quite up to the level of other books in terms of like their literary value.
Right. Sorry. I'm wondering if, I was kind of stumbling, you probably noticed I was kind of stumbling when I asked.
Well, it's been 20 years or roughly since I read it, so I'm afraid I don't recall a whole lot about it. But, it's interesting talking about the different aspects of books and why they're good and why we like them. But, I definitely do remember being moved by The Snow Leopard in terms of just the language he uses and some of the things he relates. I remember really clearly him talking about his experience with psychedelics and just how he became disillusioned with them. And it was just an incredibly beautiful passage or section of the book, just him describing the experiences and why he felt like he was over them. And it was just really crystallized, like why he was right, like why, psychedelics were profound and maybe even valuable. But in the end, there was kind of a limit to how far you could go with them. And, that's not something really that you get from Bhikkhu Rahula's book, who, maybe a little bit he talks about that, but he doesn't really explore it in detail. But at the same time, like you said, the Snow Leopard is not a Theravada book. It's not I can't even remember if it's really explicitly a Buddhist book. So in that sense, there's, kind of a sense of distance between, him and his experiences and my experiences, where, these three guys, are all meditating in the Theravada tradition for the most part. They've been to a lot of places that I've been in Asia, in Burma and in India. And they talk about teachers that, if maybe I didn't meet them, but I know of them. And so there's a real feeling of closeness to these guys, even if their books aren't quite up to the level of other books in terms of like their literary value.
Yeah, that's great. And it really epitomizes like that who you are at a certain moment, what your station in life is, what you're going through, and the book that finds you, that you interact with that book in that way. And just as you described the way you interacted with the Snow Leopard 20 years ago when you were who you were and you were reading this, and, hey, I don't think either of us would want to read Ayn Rand, The Fountainhead again, but at the moment that we read that, we were both about 19 years old or so. That was one of the most impactful books we read at the time. So I think that's really interesting, and that you reading these books when you did, instead of 15 years earlier, which would have been a different reaction, would have been a completely different review of it. Or you might not have done any kind of review and just thought, this is all worthless. This is all time I should be spending on the cushion. And that's what I'm going to do. But instead, we get a review and a podcast out of you because you read it at this station in life.
Yeah, well, it's definitely not how most book reviews go. Most book reviews are about, books that are published kind of in the moment. So reviewing 3 books from the 1970s is kind of behind the times, but hopefully it's been interesting.
Yeah, it's been great. And is there any last thing you want to add?
No, I don't think so. It's been great being on, and I appreciate you spending the time talking to me.
Okay, yeah. Well, thanks for taking the time to write the essay and have the talk, and maybe we'll do another book review one of these days.
All right. Catch you later, Joel.
I hope you found today's episode as enriching and inspiring to listen to, as we all did working to produce it. While all of the members on our team are either strict volunteers or professionals working for a substantial discount, there is still an unavoidable cost involved in creating each episode. We have limited funds for the remaining content we still hope to be able to produce, and so every additional donation gives our podcast run just a little more life. If you would like to hear some more episodes like these and have means to help with even small contributions, any donation goes directly into our fund to cover these overall production costs. Thank you in advance, and look forward to seeing you back here next week. If you would like to join in our mission to share the Dhamma from the Golden Land more widely, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Every cent goes immediately and directly to sustaining the programming. You can give right on our website via credit card by going to insightmyanmar.org/donation, or through PayPal by going to paypal.me/insightmyanmar. We also take donation through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. In all cases, simply search Insight Myanmar on each platform and you'll find our account. Alternatively, you can also visit our website for specific links to any of these respective accounts, or feel free to email us at info@insightmyanmar.org. In all cases, that's Insight Myanmar, one word, spelled INSIGHTMYANMAR. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. Thank you for your kind consideration. You have been listening to the Insight Myanmar podcast. We would appreciate it very much if you would be willing to rate, review, and or share this podcast. Every little bit of feedback helps. If you are interested, you can subscribe to the Insight Myanmar podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, please check out our website for a list of our complete episodes, including additional text, videos, and other information at www.insightmyanmar.org. That's Insight Myanmar, one word, INSIGHTMYANMAR. If you cannot find our feed on your podcast player, please let us know and we will ensure that it can be offered there. There was certainly a lot to talk about in this episode, and we'd like to encourage listeners to keep the discussion going. Make a post, request specific questions, and join in our discussions on the Insight Myanmar podcast Facebook group. You are also most welcome to follow our Facebook and Instagram accounts by the same name of Insight Myanmar. And if you're not on Facebook, you can also message us directly at burmadhamma@gmail.com. That's BURMADHAMMA@gmail.com, and we're also active on Dhamma Wheel. If you'd like to start up a discussion group on another platform, let us know and we can share that forum here. Finally, we're open to suggestions about guests or topics for future episodes, so if you have someone or something in mind, please do be in touch. We would also like to take this time to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, especially our two sound engineers, Martin Combs and Tharng A. There's of course Zach Hessler, content collaborator and part-time co-host. Ken Pransky helps with editing. Dragos Bandita and Andre Francois produce original artwork, and a special Mongolian volunteer who is asked to remain anonymous does our social media templates. We'd also like to thank everyone who assisted us in arranging for the guests we have interviewed so far. And of course, we send a big thank you to the guests themselves for agreeing to come and share such powerful personal stories. Finally, we are immensely grateful for the donors who made this entire thing possible. We also remind our listeners that the opinions expressed by our guests are their own and not necessarily reflective of the host or other podcast contributors. Please also note, as we are mainly a volunteer team, we do not have the capacity to fact-check our guest interviews. By virtue of being invited on our show, there is a trust that they will be truthful and not misrepresent themselves or others. If you have any concerns about the statements made on this or other shows, please contact us. This recording is the exclusive right of Insight Myanmar podcast and may not be used without the expressed written permission of the podcast owner, which includes video, audio, written transcripts, and excerpts of any episodes. It is also not meant to be used for commercial purposes. On the other hand, we are very open to collaboration, so if you have a particular idea in mind for sharing any of our podcasts or podcast-related information, please feel free to contact us with your proposal. As you know, our podcasts are 100% listener-supported. We welcome your contribution in any amount, denomination, and transfer method. You may give via Patreon at patreon.com/insightmyanmar, via PayPal at paypal.me/insightmyanmar, or by credit card by going to insightmyanmar.org/donation. In all cases, that's Insight Myanmar, one word, INSIGHTMYANMAR. If you'd like to give especially to support our new run of coronavirus episodes, please go on the GoFundMe site and search Insight Myanmar to find our campaign. If you are in Myanmar and would like to give a cash donation, please feel free to get in touch with us. Thanks, and see you next show.